Hi guys. Tonight we slip quietly into another world, one that smells of wood smoke and damp wool. You are standing just beyond the flickering edge of a medieval Crusader camp. The wind has teeth. It bites through your sleeves and nips your ears, while the stars above look like chips of ice. You probably will not survive this night without a thick blanket, a strong stomach, and a little borrowed courage. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, close your eyes, and follow me into the story. You trudge through crunchy, half-frozen soil. The tents look ghostly under the moon, their outlines trembling in the wind. Every Crusader here came expecting heat, a blazing desert, golden halos over Jerusalem. None of them imagined this kind of cold. It is the year 1097, near the mountains of Anatolia, and the temperature has dropped so low that armor rings like a bell when struck. Men from France and Flanders curse the climate, their breath rising in white clouds that hang between them like ghosts of unspoken regrets. The first Crusaders had never seen anything like this. They thought the East would be all sand and sunshine. The chronicles say their wine froze solid at night, their bread turned hard as stone, and horses dropped in the dark from cold exhaustion. You picture yourself among them, stamping your feet, trying to coax life into your fingers. The fires burn low because wood is scarce. The only trees worth cutting are miles away, and even then the damp logs hiss and spit instead of glowing. Metal armor is a poor companion in the cold. Every plate, every chain link, acts like a refrigerator pressed against your skin. The early Crusaders did not know yet how to balance protection and warmth. They learned the hard way that the enemy was not only human but elemental. Frost could kill faster than any Saracen arrow. To survive, they started to stuff scraps of wool or straw beneath their hauberks, anything that would trap a layer of warmth. Historians still argue whether this desperate improvisation inspired later padded armor designs, or if it was merely a temporary act of survival that never reached home. As you wander closer to the fires, you notice the smells: smoke, unwashed bodies, the faint sweetness of roasting grain. The camp feels alive in a shivering, feverish way. Men mutter prayers through chattering teeth. Some warm their hands by the embers and talk about their families back in Europe, describing warm hearths and wives who wait by candlelight. Others joke crudely, trying to laugh the cold away. It is easier to laugh than to feel your toes stiffen. A priest walks by, clutching a cross so tightly his knuckles are pale. He whispers a benediction to the men, promising that the Holy Land will reward their suffering. You can see doubt in their eyes. Faith burns bright in stories, but flickers like a candle in wind when your fingers are numb. Still, for a moment, the priest's words sound like warmth itself. Some of them kneel, not out of devotion, but because squatting closer to the ground shields them from the wind. The chronicles of Fulcher of Chartres mention how many froze to death along the march to Antioch. You think about that men dying not from swords but from shivering in their sleep. Frost crept over their beards, turned their breath to ice, and in the morning they simply did not wake. Yet others survived by pure stubbornness. They wrapped their feet in cloth soaked in animal fat, sealed their sleeves with twine, and shared body heat like brothers in arms. The cold forced them into an intimacy they might never admit in daylight. You feel that bond when you imagine yourself there. You hear the rustle of wool, the clink of chainmail, and the crack of firewood. Someone nearby coughs, and another replies with a hoarse hymn that rises slowly into the night air. It is not pretty, but it fills the silence, and somehow that helps. There is something strangely peaceful about this scene once you let the wind's rhythm settle in your ears. The distant howl of wolves echoes from the hills. It blends with the murmured Latin prayers and the occasional neigh of a horse. You sense both danger and beauty, two sides of the same frozen coin. A fringe account written decades later insists that some Crusaders believed the cold was divine punishment for their sins, sent to purify them before they could touch sacred soil. Modern historians doubt that. They suggest it was less theology and more bad logistics. After all, few medieval armies ever planned for snow in Anatolia. Still, the story lingers, like frost on canvas. You imagine waking at dawn. The first light spills over the plain, pale and indifferent. You pull your cloak tighter, stand, and stamp your boots to shake off ice crystals. The cold bites, but you breathe it in anyway. It smells of endurance, of history still forming beneath your feet. The Crusaders will move on soon, dragging their carts and banners southward. Some will curse the day they left home. Others will swear the hardship brings them closer to God. You too start to understand both feelings at once. The cold strips everything away until only determination remains. It is not glory that keeps you alive out here. It is stubborn, ordinary human will, the same spark that keeps a campfire glowing long after the wind should have killed it. And as the night deepens again, you find yourself listening to that faint hum of life under the stars, realizing that survival is an act of quiet rebellion. The wind grows sharper as you step farther from the firelight. Every gust carries the taste of iron and ash, wrapping itself around your armor until it feels like you are standing inside a bell made of ice. The metal hums faintly against your body, a reminder that your protection has turned into a trap. The Crusaders quickly discovered that armor could save you from arrows but invite frostbite. You shift your weight, listening to the creak of frozen leather straps and the dull rattle of chainmail settling against your tunic. At first, no one thought about warmth when they dressed for battle. Armor was everything. A knight's sense of worth was forged into every rivet and buckle. But now, as you imagine yourself among them, you realize how punishing it must have been to march under a sky that dripped cold silver rain, your armor clinging to you like a second, freezing skin. The air slips through every joint, and soon the weight that once made you feel powerful only reminds you how human you are beneath it all. Some soldiers tried lining their hauberks with wool or rags, anything that could dull the bite of metal. Others wore thin leather jerkins beneath the chain links, an early experiment in insulation. There is a strange mix of practicality and desperation in these choices. Chroniclers describe men wrapping linen bandages around their arms or stuffing straw under their breastplates. It looked ridiculous, but when your bones ache and your breath steams like smoke, pride matters less than survival. Historians still argue whether these makeshift solutions influenced later padded garments like the gambeson. Some believe this crude layering was the origin of better battlefield design, while others insist it was nothing more than chance improvisation born of suffering. You bend down and imagine touching the frozen links. They bite your fingertips instantly, a tiny spark of pain. The metal remembers the night. Its surface shines faintly under the moon, coated in a film of frost. The clinking sound of a dozen knights shifting in their armor fills the air like a broken melody. It is the music of endurance. There are stories from the early Crusades of men sleeping in armor out of fear of sudden attack. You can almost hear the stiff joints squeaking as they toss and turn. The human body was never meant to rest beneath iron. By morning, fingers swelled, joints locked, and every breath came with a small groan. But taking it off at night was dangerous too. Raiders, wild dogs, and sudden alarms meant you could die half-dressed, struggling to fasten a buckle in the dark. One chronicler from the 12th century described the sight of dawn breaking over the camp like a field of statues, the frost their sculptor. He said the men looked holy and horrible at once, pale faces rising from collars of steel, each one glazed with ice. You can picture it clearly. Frozen eyelids, hands locked around sword hilts, as if even in sleep they refused to surrender. It was not only the cold that haunted them, but the way it crept into their weapons. Swords grew brittle, bowstrings snapped, and shields cracked from moisture trapped in their grain. A soldier's gear, once a badge of pride, became another enemy to manage. Some melted bits of wax or animal fat over their armor to create a thin barrier against condensation. It worked for a while, though the smell must have been dreadful. There is a curious tale told by later travelers who claimed a group of Crusaders rubbed olive oil into their chainmail, believing it would keep the metal warm. It did not, of course, but it made the links gleam handsomely by firelight. Historians are uncertain whether this was vanity or superstition, perhaps both. Humans will always look for comfort in ritual, even when it makes little sense. The cold changed the soundscape too. When men moved, their armor creaked and chimed differently, higher and thinner in the chill air. Every step echoed longer across the frozen ground. You imagine standing watch and hearing that distant metallic rhythm, knowing your comrades were near but invisible in the mist. It was both reassurance and warning. To deal with the chill, many began to strip off unnecessary plates when they could. Helmets were often left aside except during battle, because the metal pressed ice against their cheeks. Some knights tied bits of cloth inside the helm as padding, hoping to trap a pocket of warmth. A fringe record mentions that certain Crusaders began wearing fur-lined caps under their helmets, copying Eastern soldiers they met on the road. The idea must have seemed strange to them at first, almost decadent, but necessity overruled pride. Armor had once symbolized glory and discipline, but out here it became an experiment in endurance. Every layer was a question. Protection or pain? Too much, and you froze in your own sweat. Too little, and the wind sliced through you like a knife. You can feel that tension, that daily negotiation between safety and sanity. As the night deepens, the camp grows quieter. The faint crackle of the last fire dies away. You listen to the armor cooling, the slow, fading clicks as metal contracts in the cold. The sound is almost soothing, like rain on a tin roof. You can imagine falling asleep to it, wrapped in a scratchy wool cloak, half dreaming of home. A final thought crosses your mind as you rest in that imagined camp. The Crusaders set out believing their armor made them invincible, but the cold taught them humility faster than any battle. It reminded them, and you, that survival depends less on faith or iron, and more on how cleverly a person can adapt. You wake to a pale dawn and the faint smell of damp wool. The cold has crept into everything. Your fingers ache even before you move them, and your breath leaves slow ghosts that drift into the morning mist. You glance down at your clothes, wondering how these layers will carry you through another frozen night. For the Crusaders, clothing was both a shield and a puzzle. They came from lands where winters were wet and mild, but here, the chill felt different, sharper, thinner, the kind that crawled into your bones and stayed there. Most chroniclers of the age agree that wool was the Crusaders' truest ally. It could be heavy, itchy, and slow to dry, but it trapped air like a miracle. A thick tunic of coarse wool over a linen shift made the difference between endurance and misery. You imagine the soldiers pulling their tunics tighter, grateful for every patch and stitch. According to several surviving records, even nobles wore plain wool beneath their finery when the cold deepened. The crusade leveled all ranks when the frost set in. One curious note appears in the letters of a Burgundian knight, who described wrapping strips of linen around his calves before pulling on his hose, a trick he claimed to have learned from Syrian herders. The linen wicked away sweat, while the outer wool stayed dry enough to trap heat. The ingenuity of this layering might seem simple now, but for men used to armor and ceremony, it was an act of quiet adaptation. Researchers remain divided on how quickly European soldiers adopted these local methods. Some argue that they resisted foreign influence for pride's sake, while others believe they were quick to borrow any idea that promised relief. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, buried under centuries of embellishment. What is certain is that necessity taught them faster than any sermon. You picture the camp again, tunics drying on spears, cloaks hung like sails to catch the weak Sunday. The smell of wet wool lingers, thick and earthy, blending with smoke and sweat. Each soldier learned to layer by instinct, first linen, soft against the skin to absorb moisture, then wool, thick and scratchy but alive with warmth, and finally, if fortune smiled, a cloak of fur or heavy canvas to block the wind. It was not elegant, but it worked. The most trusted weavers back home had no idea their cloth would be stretched across distant battlefields, stitched and restitched until it looked more patchwork than garment. A few inventive souls even stuffed grass between layers for insulation. Some later historians see in this the earliest hint of quilted clothing, though others dismiss it as desperate improvisation. One obscure account tells of a group of Crusaders who lined their boots with thin parchment to keep the damp out. It sounds absurd, yet parchment, when dry, formed a stiff barrier that might have spared them from frostbite. Such odd experiments reveal the blend of resourcefulness and superstition that defined medieval survival. You can almost feel their frustration as they tugged at stiff boots, muttering prayers under their breath. As you run your fingers over your own imagined sleeves, the fibers rasp faintly. The sound feels alive, comforting in its roughness. The camp around you moves slowly, men adjusting their clothing, shaking out blankets, tying hoods under their chins. Even in stillness, everyone is in motion, wrestling with the elements one fold of fabric at a time. By midday, the sun shines weakly. The wool warms to the touch, carrying the faint scent of lanolin and smoke. You think about how that same warmth would cling to a crusader's heart, half faith, half stubbornness. There is something intimate about their relationship with fabric, as if each layer represented not just protection from the world, but defiance against it. A monk writing decades later noted that the cold humbled the proud. His words still echo in the fabric of history. For all their armor and banners, the Crusaders were taught by the simplest things: cloth, breath, and the patience to endure. You can almost hear that lesson whispering through time as the night begins to gather again. The wind returns at dusk, sighing through the camp like an old friend come to test their strength once more. Wool cloaks flutter, hoods draw tight, and the first sparks of fire appear across the plain. The same ritual repeats: layer, bind, pray, and hope that the warmth will hold till morning. It is a fragile balance, one built on every thread they owned. You feel the rough fabric brush your neck, the cool air sneaking beneath it, the pulse of your heartbeat against the cold. For a moment, you understand what they must have felt, a mixture of fear and fascination, trapped between history and the elements, surviving one breath at a time. The camp spreads like a patchwork city of cloth and rope. From a distance, it looks almost peaceful, a sea of pale tents swaying gently under a grey sky. Up close, you can smell the dampness of canvas, the musk of leather ties, and the faint sweetness of straw packed beneath sleeping mats. This is where the Crusaders learned what it truly meant to live between battles, huddled beneath fabric walls that groaned and flapped with the wind. Most chroniclers of the period agree that Crusader tents came in all shapes and tempers. The nobles slept under large pavilions, some striped with faded colour, held up by wooden poles scavenged from broken wagons. Common soldiers shared low, conical shelters, patched with whatever scraps they could find. A few accounts even mention that men would dig shallow pits and stretch hides across them, turning the earth itself into insulation. It was not beauty they built here, but survival. A curious entry in a knight's journal from the First Crusade describes tents frozen solid overnight, their canvas stiff like carved stone. The men had to light fires around the edges just to make the fabric pliable enough to fold. You imagine that scene vividly, smoke curling upward while tired hands tugged at ropes stiff with frost. The air must have smelled of scorched linen and wet ashes. Experts remain divided on how effective those early tents truly were. Some argue that the canvas used was too thin to keep out the chill, while others suggest layers of felt or animal hide gave surprising warmth. The evidence, like the fabric itself, has weathered with time, but there is little doubt that the Crusaders became skilled improvisers. When the wind screamed through camp, they built low stone walls around their tents, stacked shields as barriers, or draped cloaks over gaps to block drafts. You can hear it now, the sound of rope creaking under tension, stakes tapping into frozen ground, curses muttered through chattering teeth. The work of pitching a tent in winter was almost a battle on its own. A single slip, a broken peg, and the fabric would collapse, burying exhausted men under wet folds of misery. Yet somehow they managed, every night rebuilding their fragile shelters with the patience of those who had no choice. One strange detail appears in the writings of a Genoese merchant who followed the armies. He claimed that some Crusaders carried small copper bowls which they heated with coals, placing them inside tents for warmth. The idea feels oddly modern, though it likely filled the air with smoke and the constant risk of fire. Still, the thought of that dim red glow flickering beneath canvas has a certain comfort to it. You can almost see the soft light playing across weary faces, the warmth too fleeting to waste. According to most medieval sources, a knight's tent was a symbol of his rank, sometimes even painted with his coat of arms. Yet under the frost, all colours faded. The cold stripped away distinctions. A noble might have more space to freeze in, but the cold treated everyone equally. In the poorer quarters of the camp, men shared shelters meant for two or three, lying shoulder to shoulder on straw, their breaths mingling in pale clouds. A lesser-known note from a later crusade mentions that tents were occasionally lined with horsehair fabric. It was rough and unpleasant, but provided excellent insulation. Whether that innovation came from Eastern traders or local soldiers remains uncertain, but it shows how necessity pushed invention forward. There is something poetic about the idea that warmth could be found in discomfort, that survival often required embracing what was once rejected. The nights were long, and the tents turned into small worlds of whispered stories. You can almost hear them now, soft voices under the wind, the murmur of prayers, the clink of a cup passed hand to hand. The cold outside seemed endless, but inside those cramped shelters, human warmth gathered like a second fire. Some men hung charms over their entrances, bits of bone or crosses carved from wood. Others etched symbols into the fabric, convinced it would keep spirits away. Modern researchers have noted that the layout of Crusader camps often followed military order, yet at night, lines blurred. Soldiers dragged their tents closer together, forming clusters for warmth and companionship. The geometry of strategy softened into the shape of community. The wind might shake the walls, but the laughter and quiet conversation inside reminded them that they were still alive. As the wind howls, you crouch near one of these tents. The fabric trembles but holds. The light from a nearby fire flickers through the seams, painting moving shadows on the inside. For a moment, it feels like the whole camp breathes as one, the sound of hundreds of lives straining together against the cold. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the texture of the canvas under your palm, rough and solid, a small defiance against the vast chill of the world beyond. The Crusaders did not have modern tents or sleeping bags, but they had persistence stitched into every seam. Each night was a test of endurance, each morning a quiet victory. And as you stand there, letting the fabric whisper and the embers crackle, you understand why the cold never broke them completely. It could freeze the air, stiffen the ropes, and dim the stars, but it could not silence the will to endure. The fire is alive tonight, glowing low and orange at the center of camp. Sparks drift upward like tiny prayers, carried away by the wind before they can fade. You crouch close to the warmth, your hands spread over the coals, feeling the skin of your palms tighten and loosen with the heat. Every Crusader knows that the fire is the heart of survival. It cooks, dries, warms, and comforts. When the flames flicker, so does hope. Contemporary chronicles describe how firekeeping became a sacred duty. Whoever guarded the embers through the night guarded the lives of everyone around them. The cold could snuff out a camp faster than any ambush. Even a thin bed of coals meant that breakfast would come sooner, that fingers could still move, and that stories could still be told. The light of those fires stitched the darkness into something almost human. A curious note appears in the writings of a Norman knight who claimed some men slept in turns near the fire, rotating like clockwork to make sure no one froze or fell asleep too close to the flames. The idea seems simple now, but to them, it was a rhythm of survival. Each man trusted the one beside him to keep the light alive. Archaeologists have found traces of scorched stones at old Crusader sites, evidence that soldiers dug shallow pits for their fires to trap heat and shield the flames from the wind. This was clever, born of trial and error, a lesson learned under frostbitten moons. It remains uncertain who first discovered the technique, but many historians suggest it came from Bedouin guides familiar with desert nights that turned deadly cold. Such cultural exchanges were often unspoken, yet they shaped the daily life of the Crusaders more than any sermon. The smell of smoke becomes your anchor. It clings to your cloak, seeps into your hair, and never leaves your skin. Some accounts mention that the Crusaders used dung and dried grass when wood was scarce. The odor was unpleasant, but the heat was real. One odd tale from a lesser-known chronicler describes a group who roasted stale bread directly on their shields, letting it blacken and bubble. They ate it anyway, laughing between coughs of smoke. Hunger and humor often shared the same seat at the fire. Experts remain divided about how organized these nightly gatherings were. Some believe the fires were small and private, one per group of soldiers, while others imagine larger communal blazes that became places of song and confession. The truth likely changed with circumstance. A few embers in a storm meant survival. A roaring fire in calm weather meant companionship. The music of these camps was unrefined but heartfelt. Someone would hum a tune from home, and others joined in, their voices trembling with both cold and memory, the flames reflected in their eyes, turning them golden and alive again. You can almost hear it now, that low chorus drifting across the tents, each note blending with the crack of firewood and the soft hiss of smoke. There is a strange comfort in the way light shapes the night. Inside its circle, faces glow warm, and shadows dance just beyond reach. The Crusaders must have felt it too, the illusion of safety, the momentary forgetfulness. The fire was not only heat, it was civilization itself, drawn small and fragile against an endless wilderness. One peculiar report claims that certain commanders forbade singing after midnight, believing that laughter drew spirits. Whether superstition or discipline, such rules remind you how thin the line was between fear and order. Out here, faith and fire were almost the same thing. Both burned, both guided, and both could die if neglected. As you sit in silence, watching the embers pulse like a slow heartbeat, it becomes clear why fire meant more than warmth. It was memory. Every spark carried whispers of other nights, other camps, other men staring into the same orange light. Even now, centuries later, the image feels timeless. Humanity huddled around heat, surrounded by cold and uncertainty, finding comfort in shared breath and fading stories. You notice how your eyes grow heavy, lulled by the rhythmic pop of wood. The cold still presses at your back, but the fire holds it at bay. For a moment, the entire world narrows to that single glow. The sound of crackling replaces thought. The warmth draws close enough to make you forget how far from home you are. In the end, this is what survival looked like. Not grand battles or shining armor, but the quiet ritual of tending a flame. It was the one small rebellion the Crusaders could win every night. As the wind sighs across the camp and the coals sink into darkness, you realize that history's greatest endurance often began with something as simple as keeping a fire alive. The night stretches long, heavy with silence broken only by the soft shuffle of boots on frozen ground. Inside the tents, men settle onto beds that hardly deserve the name. The fire's warmth fades quickly, and what remains is the cold press of the earth beneath them. You lower yourself to the ground too, and the chill reaches through your clothes like a slow, deliberate hand. This is what it felt like for the Crusaders who learned that rest was never comfort but negotiation. Most contemporary sources mention that straw was the sleeping man's best companion. It was cheap, common, and, when dry, a miracle of warmth. The men would gather it wherever they could, stuffing it beneath cloaks or spreading it on the floor of their tents. The faint rustle as they turned in their sleep became the lullaby of the camp. One chronicler wrote that he preferred the sound of straw to prayer bells because at least it promised a kind of peace. Archaeological traces found near old Crusader routes confirm the presence of burnt hay and reeds, suggesting that straw bedding was often reused until it rotted or caught fire. Some historians think the Crusaders learned from local shepherds how to mix straw with dry leaves to make softer bedding. Others argue it was simply the instinct of any traveller to use what the land provided. What matters is that this fragile layer of nature kept them alive through nights when frost thickened on their beards. A curious report from a German knight mentions using saddles as pillows and horse blankets as mattresses. The smell must have been unbearable, but the warmth was worth it. A different account, less credible but charmingly strange, claims that one group of soldiers lined their tents with feathers stolen from local markets, creating what they proudly called beds fit for heaven. Scholars doubt the truth of it, though they admit it reflects the human need to dream even in hardship. There was an art to arranging a sleeping space in the cold. Men would dig shallow hollows into the soil to block the wind and then spread straw in thick layers. Cloaks went on top, and sometimes a spare tunic or a saddlecloth doubled as a blanket. If you picture it now, you can see the faint steam rising from rows of sleeping bodies, the collective warmth forming a cloud above them. The smell of sweat, damp wool, and straw fills the air, pungent but somehow comforting. Experts remain divided about whether the Crusaders carried bedding from Europe or made it all along the way. Some suggest they began with linen sheets and blankets that were quickly abandoned as impractical. Others believe only nobles could afford such luxuries. For most soldiers, sleep was a trade between exhaustion and frostbite. They rested when their bodies gave in, not when comfort allowed. One obscure manuscript from a monastery in Antioch notes that a few men stuffed old tunics with straw to create crude sleeping mats. It is one of those tiny details that brings history close enough to touch. You can almost hear the whisper of fabric as it's filled, the soft rustle as someone settles down and sighs into the cold air. It is a small act of defiance, this attempt to soften the world even a little. The ground itself was never still. Rain turned it to mud, frost made it unyielding, and sometimes snow gathered in pale drifts at the tent entrances. Crusaders would stamp and shovel, muttering under their breath, before lying down again on ground that refused to care about their suffering. Yet despite it all, they slept. Sleep came like surrender, heavy and absolute. Occasionally, the lucky few shared warmth with animals. Horses, mules, and dogs slept nearby, their breath creating pockets of heat. A knight might lean his back against his horse's flank for warmth, whispering into its mane before drifting off. There is something tender in that image, a moment of quiet understanding between two creatures enduring the same night. A lesser-known fact found in later accounts suggests that soldiers often removed their boots before sleeping, no matter the cold, because frostbite was worse when sweat froze inside leather. They would hang the boots near the fire or under their cloaks to dry. It was one of those small lessons learned through pain, passed from veteran to recruit in murmured advice. When you close your eyes now, you can feel the rough straw pricking your palms and the faint hum of life all around. The cold gnaws at the edges of your body, but the core remains warm, protected by layers of cloth, straw, and shared breath. The camp sighs in unison, 1,000 quiet hearts beating in rhythm beneath a frozen sky. The night deepens. The wind moans softly, brushing against the tent walls like a ghost searching for entry. Somewhere, a soldier turns in his sleep and mutters a name. The sound fades, leaving only the rustle of straw. You breathe deeply, letting that sound lull you too. For a few fleeting hours, even war makes room for rest. The air grows still, and the camp lies wrapped in shadow. A few fires still flicker, their glow touching the edges of 100 cloaks drawn tight around tired bodies. You pull yours closer, feeling the weight of the fabric settle over your shoulders. It smells of smoke and travel, damp at the hem and coarse against your skin. Tonight, you begin to understand why the cloak was more than an accessory. For a Crusader, it was identity, armor, and blanket all in one. Most medieval chroniclers agree that a soldier's cloak was among his most prized possessions. It carried warmth, color, and meaning. Knights of different orders wore distinct hues: the white of the Templars, the black of the Hospitallers, the red of certain noble houses. But under the stars, all cloaks turned the same shade of shadow, drawn close against the night. The symbolism faded when frost came. The cloak's first duty was not glory but survival. There is a curious note in a Frankish letter describing how soldiers soaked their cloaks in oil or fat before long marches to repel rain and wind. It worked only partly, leaving behind a rank smell that clung for days, but it made the fabric heavier and more resistant to cold gusts. Some historians believe this crude waterproofing technique inspired later military practices. Others suggest it was simply desperation disguised as innovation. Whatever the truth, you can almost imagine that greasy sheen catching firelight, a dull armor against the elements. A forgotten chronicler from the Third Crusade tells of men sleeping rolled tightly in their cloaks like cocoons, heads covered, hands tucked in. The image feels both childish and touching, 1,000 grown men trying to imitate safety. He wrote that in the morning, frost coated the outer layers so thickly they crackled when shaken. Yet inside, the warmth endured just enough to keep breath visible. Researchers continue to debate the quality of these cloaks. Some claim they were made of dense wool imported from Flanders or Italy. Others argue that local weavers near the ports supplied rougher, cheaper versions. The surviving fragments from later centuries show weaves so thick they could almost stand upright. A cloak like that was not fashion. It was shelter that followed you everywhere. You can hear the sound it makes in your imagination, a soft brushing against armor as men move, a rhythmic flap as they walk through the wind. Every fold holds a story. The edges are torn where horses have stepped, the corners burnt from stray sparks, the collar darkened by sweat. These small imperfections became a record of endurance. One curious footnote mentions that some Crusaders slept in pairs, their cloaks spread together to form a single blanket. It was practical rather than affectionate, but it carried an intimacy rarely spoken of. In the shared space of a cloak, warmth passed like a secret. There was no shame in survival. According to most accounts, even leaders like Godfrey of Bouillon or Richard the Lionheart prized their cloaks more than ceremonial robes. A noble might own silks for council and fur for ceremony, but when night fell, he reached for wool. The cloak blurred the line between rich and poor. Around the fire, every man looked the same, weary, wrapped, and watching the smoke drift upward. There is a peculiar legend about a knight who lost his cloak during a storm and tried to sleep wrapped only in his banner. The wind shredded it before dawn, leaving him shaking and humiliated. Some storytellers use the tale as a moral about pride, others as a simple warning. Banners are for glory, not warmth. Whether it happened or not, it captures the truth that faith and fervor could not replace a good piece of fabric. Archaeological finds near ancient encampments occasionally reveal cloak pins and bronze brooches, corroded but still recognizable. They remind you that even in hardship, the Crusaders cared about detail. A decorated clasp could make a man feel human again. To fasten your cloak was to declare, quietly, that you still belong to the living. When the wind rises again, you feel it tug at the edge of your cloak. You draw it tighter, wrapping it around your knees. The wool grows warmer with every breath trapped beneath it. It carries the faint rhythm of your heartbeat, a small reassurance in a restless world. The night deepens, and the camp murmurs like a dreaming beast. Hundreds of cloaks rustle at once, whispering against the cold. You listen to that chorus, a soft percussion of survival. In this sound, you realize that comfort is never given freely. It is earned with patience, shared with trust. and remembered through fabric that holds the scent of fire and time. The night is deep now, the kind that swallows sound and bends the stars closer to the earth. You hear faint breathing from every side of the camp, a chorus of sleepers wrapped in cloaks, stretched on straw. Yet somewhere among them, a soft snort and shifting weight break the stillness. You turn toward the edge of the firelight and see the silhouettes of animals, horses, mules, and a few shaggy dogs, each one exhaling little clouds of steam into the freezing air. Their presence is more than practical. Out here, animals are warmth made flesh. Most surviving accounts confirm that Crusaders kept their beasts close at night. Horses were tethered near the tents, sometimes even sharing partial shelter. The body heat of a horse could lift the temperature of a small tent by several degrees, a fact the soldiers learned quickly and never forgot. You picture a weary knight leaning against his mount, both wrapped in exhaustion, both breathing in time. A strange companionship, born of shared endurance, bound man and beast together in ways that books rarely describe. An obscure diary from a camp outside Antioch mentions that soldiers sometimes draped spare blankets over their horses' backs at night to prevent frost from stiffening the animal's muscles. It was a gesture both compassionate and selfish, for a frozen horse could mean death on the march. Archaeological studies of horse gear recovered in the Levant suggest that wool or felt padding was often used under saddles, doubling as insulation. The evidence fits with these descriptions, small fragments of care hidden beneath the machinery of war. A curious note from a later chronicler tells of soldiers sleeping side by side with their dogs, particularly the large mastiffs used for guarding the camp. The animals' fur trapped heat, and their loyalty offered a sense of safety. One chronicler described it almost tenderly, writing that a faithful hound made finer company than any candle. The image is intimate, even gentle. You can almost feel the slow rise and fall of the dog's body against a sleeping soldier's back, the heartbeat steady and familiar. Experts remain divided on whether camels were ever used for warmth during the early Crusades. Some sources suggest the Crusaders learned from desert traders to huddle near the animals' flanks when the wind grew cruel. Others argue that cultural distance and suspicion kept them apart. Still, you can imagine the temptation. A massive creature radiating heat in the icy night, breathing like a furnace. Whether or not they dared, the idea lingers like a whisper of possibility. Animals gave more than warmth. Their quiet presence offered rhythm. The snort of a horse, the soft click of hooves shifting in the mud, the gentle sigh of a mule resting its weight. All these sounds lulled men to sleep. In a world of uncertainty, the steadiness of a beast's breath became proof that life endured. A camp without animals felt empty, lifeless, as though the heartbeat of the army had stopped. One strange detail appears in a letter from a priest traveling with the armies. He claimed some soldiers whispered prayers to their horses before sleep, asking God to guard their strength and keep their hooves sound. It sounds superstitious, but perhaps it was simply gratitude disguised as ritual. The same men might have brushed frost from their horses' nostrils in the morning, speaking softly as if to a friend. When you walk between the lines of tethered animals, you can sense the warmth in the air around them. The smell is heavy, sweat, manure, straw, but strangely reassuring. Steam rises from their bodies, curling into the dark. Some Crusaders probably envied them, their thick coats and simple acceptance of the cold. To sleep beside such warmth was a privilege few mocked. A lesser-known account from an Italian observer claims that the Crusaders believed their horses could sense approaching frost before humans did, stamping and huffing restlessly hours before the temperature dropped. Whether that was myth or observation remains unclear, but it gave the soldiers one more reason to keep close to their mounts. In the uncertainty of the wild, every sign felt sacred. You stand quietly now, listening to the rhythm of the animals. Their warmth is a kind of music, low and pulsing. It mixes with the faint murmur of distant prayers and the crackle of dying fires. The cold presses around the camp, but the living heat at its center refuses to yield. The beasts shift and breathe, their bodies radiating steadiness while the stars above seem frozen in place. It is humbling to think that so many lives, so many dreams of holy conquest, depended on creatures that asked for nothing more than food, touch, and rest. They carried the Crusaders by day and kept them alive by night. In return, they received the small mercy of being treated, at least in those hours, as companions rather than tools. You linger beside a horse now, hand resting on its neck. The skin quivers beneath your palm, warm and alive. The world feels smaller here, the wind less cruel. In this shared warmth, the distance between species disappears. All that remains is survival, and a fragile, wordless understanding beneath the frozen stars. The night has settled into that slow rhythm where hunger and fatigue weave together. Around the camp, fires sputter softly, releasing the faint smell of broth and scorched grain. You crouch near one, your hands cupped around a dented iron bowl. Inside, a thin soup ripples in the heat, little more than water, salt, and whatever scraps could be spared. It is not a feast, but it is life. For the Crusaders, warmth did not only come from cloaks or straw. It came from within, in the form of food that promised strength and a little hope. According to the most reliable chronicles, their diet during campaigns was a grim affair of bread, dried peas, salted meat, and wine diluted with water. When rations ran low, they ground acorns or roots into coarse flour, shaping rough cakes that baked in the embers. One soldier wrote that the taste was so bitter he prayed for hunger instead. Still, when the night air turned sharp and frost began to cling to the pots, anything hot felt like grace. A curious detail from a soldier's letter mentions that they often added pepper, cumin, or cinnamon traded from local merchants to disguise the staleness of rations. The spices, rare and costly back home, became a quiet comfort in the freezing dark. Some historians suggest that this mixing of Western and Eastern ingredients marked one of the earliest culinary fusions born of war. Others claim it was pure necessity, not taste, that guided their hands. Either way, the steam rising from those makeshift stews carried a scent both foreign and familiar. You imagine dipping a crust of bread into the broth, feeling the warmth spread through your fingers before it reaches your stomach. The simple act of eating becomes something meditative. The sound of spoons tapping against metal echoes softly around you. There is laughter here too, faint and tired, but genuine. For a moment, the cold loosens its grip. Some contemporary records note that knights were expected to share meals with their squires and servants during the harshest conditions. Hierarchies blurred when everyone shivered. A noble's pot might be larger, but its contents were much the same: beans, bread, and whatever could be hunted or begged from the land. The firelight made equals of them all. A lesser-known report tells of soldiers brewing hot wine mixed with honey and herbs. It was said to warm the blood and dull the ache of the cold. A monk travelling with the army scolded them for their indulgence, calling it liquid sin. But by the next winter he was drinking it too. There is something deeply human in that image. Faith yielding to the need for comfort, doctrine softened by frost. Archaeological digs near old Crusader routes have uncovered fragments of cooking pots blackened by years of use, often mended with bits of lead or copper. These small relics tell their own story of endurance. The same pot might have boiled hundreds of meals, each one shared among men who dreamed of home but settled for heat and company. When you touch the rim of such a vessel in a museum today, you can almost feel the ghost of that warmth beneath your fingertips. An odd rumor recorded in a later chronicle claims that during one particularly cold season, soldiers roasted frozen wine into slush and ate it like snow. Modern historians doubt the story, but it reflects something true about the human instinct to make humor out of misery. To joke about one's hunger was a way to keep despair at bay. Experts still discuss how the Crusaders managed to find enough fuel to cook each night. Some think they traded with local villagers for wood and charcoal. Others believe they burned dried dung mixed with straw, a technique likely borrowed from nomads. The smell must have been unforgettable, but it kept the fires alive. In the end, practicality defeated pride every time. As you lift the bowl to your lips, the taste is plain but honest. The warmth moves through you, slow and patient, until your fingers stop trembling. Around you, others do the same, their faces lit by the amber glow of the coals. There is a shared stillness now, a fragile peace born from full bellies and shared exhaustion. One chronicler described how, after meals, soldiers would sit in silence and stare into the fire, each lost in thought. Some prayed quietly. Others rubbed their hands together, whispering that the warmth was proof of divine mercy. Whether from faith or fatigue, that feeling spread through the camp like smoke. The meal was never enough, but it always mattered. The last sip of broth slides down your throat, leaving a trace of salt and ash. You set the bowl aside and listen to the night breathe again. The cold waits just beyond the circle of firelight, patient as time. But for now, it does not win. The heat from your stomach radiates outward, a gentle pulse of life. And as your eyes grow heavy, you realize that warmth, like faith, does not need abundance. It only needs persistence. The night thickens until the stars seem to shiver in their places. Around the camp, the glow of small fires burns low, and the sound of metal fades. You crouch beside a dying flame, watching a soldier coax it back to life. He breathes gently, then feeds it a few thin sticks, patient as a craftsman at his trade. Firemaking in this world is not a luxury but a skill as vital as swordsmanship. Contemporary accounts reveal that early Crusaders often struggled to start fires in the damp climates of Anatolia and northern Syria. Matches did not exist, and flint and steel were their constant companions. A knight might strike his blades back against a stone, hoping for a single spark to catch in a wad of dry grass or shredded cloth. It was a task that demanded calm hands and stubborn will, especially when the wind turned cruel. A curious entry from a chronicler in the First Crusade mentions that some soldiers carried bits of charred linen known as tinder cloth, tucked into leather pouches to stay dry. One flick of the flint could ignite its soft edges, glowing red like a captive ember. The process feels almost magical, a small act of defiance against the endless cold. Experts continue to debate whether these early armies learned improved firemaking from the locals or developed their own methods on the road. Some scholars argue that Bedouin tribes taught them to strike flint against iron pyrites instead of steel, creating brighter sparks. Others believe the Crusaders stumbled upon the trick independently, driven by necessity. Whatever the source, this mastery of spark and breath kept thousands alive through countless bitter nights. One obscure traveller's tale insists that a band of Crusaders prayed before striking their flints, believing that divine favour could guide the spark. The chronicler hints that they saw successful ignition as a small miracle. In a world where death was never far, it made sense to see holiness in a flicker of firelight. You can almost hear their soft cheers when the tinder finally glowed, faces bright with triumph over nature itself. The materials they used were rarely ideal. Damp moss, shredded bark, even horse dung, anything that could smoke before it burned. The smell must have been thick and earthy, curling through the camp like incense of desperation. A soldier's hands blackened with soot were a mark of competence. Those who could make fire were valuable companions. Archaeological findings at Crusader sites reveal blackened stones arranged in tight circles, fire pits carefully shielded from the wind. Some even show traces of melted lead or iron, suggesting that they used the embers to repair weapons and melt arrowheads. Fire was not just warmth, it was industry, medicine, and ritual combined. A lesser-known report from a monk who travelled with the armies describes how he saw soldiers drying their soaked boots by holding them near the flames until the leather smoked. They laughed as the steam rose, pretending that the smell was proof their sins were leaving them. It was gallows humour, but laughter warmed better than any blanket. One fascinating footnote tells of men using bow drills when flint was lost, twisting wooden rods against dry boards until friction coaxed out a thin trail of smoke. The method was painfully slow and rarely successful, yet it shows how far they would go for the promise of heat. You can almost feel the rhythm of their effort, the slow spin of wood, the rasp of rope, the momentary spark that drew gasps of relief. Researchers still argue about the importance of fire discipline in these camps. Some claim commanders limited open flames to avoid detection by scouts at night. Others insist that survival outweighed secrecy. Whichever was true, the fire's glow was both a comfort and a risk. Every flicker could betray their position, yet few could sleep without it. Imagine the quiet joy when the first flames caught properly, the fire licking upward, painting faces gold. Men stretched their hands toward it, murmuring prayers or simple sighs of pleasure. The hiss of damp wood, the smell of smoke, and the slow crackle became the soundtrack of safety. A curious superstition recorded in later years claimed that sparks jumping from the fire carried omens. If one landed on your cloak without burning a hole, it was a sign that you would live through the next battle. Whether anyone truly believed it or simply needed something to hope for is unclear. But around that firelight, every superstition found a place to breathe. You sit back, feeling the warmth kiss your face while your spine chills in the wind. The contrast is sharp but comforting. The fire pops again, scattering a few glowing embers into the dark. They fade almost immediately, yet for that instant, the camp feels alive, defiant, human. The spark, however brief, reminds you that even in the harshest winters of history, survival begins with something as small as light meeting breath. The fire burns lower now, a small circle of glow in a world of grey. You sit close enough to feel the heat on your knees, but the wind still finds your back. Around you, men settle into huddles of bodies, drawing close until breath and warmth mingle. You realize how strange it must have been to rely on one another in such an intimate way. In battle, they fought shoulder to shoulder, but in the cold, survival demanded something softer. According to most records, Crusaders often slept in groups to conserve warmth. A dozen soldiers might crowd into a single tent or form tight clusters under shared cloaks. It was not comfort they sought, but body heat. The warmth of another human was more reliable than any fire. Even the proudest knight set aside, rank at night, pressing close to squires or servants if it meant surviving until dawn. A curious letter from a priest who joined the march describes the sight of armored men lying together like brothers, the steam of their breathing rising through the tent seams. He wrote that the sight moved him more than any sermon. In that moment, hierarchy melted, and all were simply fragile bodies longing for warmth. Modern scholars often point out that such closeness prevented not only frostbite, but loneliness. Companionship mattered as much as insulation. After long days of hunger and fear, human contact grounded them. You can picture it now. A soldier murmuring half-remembered prayers, another laughing quietly at some old joke, both drifting towards sleep while their shoulders touch. One odd detail from a surviving chronicle says that men sometimes slept in a pattern, feet to the fire and heads toward the outer cold, forming a star-like shape that kept everyone warm at the center. It sounds almost ceremonial, as if they were drawing warmth from one another through geometry. Archaeologists have found patterns of fire pits and tent rings that seem to support this account, though no one can say for sure whether it was planned or instinctive. Experts remain divided on how much religious belief influenced these nightly gatherings. Some argue that prayer circles before sleep created emotional warmth that strengthened morale. Others think faith was merely something to fill the silence. Either way, the men who prayed together found comfort in the rhythm of shared words. Whispered Latin hymns floated through the darkness, blending with the sigh of wind and the faint crackle of distant embers. A lesser-known account from a Sicilian soldier mentions that those who felt most afraid often volunteered for watch duty. He said it was easier to face the cold than to lie awake listening to it. Yet when they returned to their tents at dawn, half frozen, others welcomed them wordlessly, wrapping them in spare cloaks. That exchange, that quiet kindness, was a warmth all its own. One peculiar observation found in a French chronicler's notes claims that some men kept smooth stones heated by the fire inside their cloaks, pressing them against their chests to trap warmth. When the stones cooled, they passed them to their companions to share what little heat remained. The gesture feels profoundly human, a small ritual of giving in a world where little could be given. The cold, in its cruelty, forced closeness. It blurred the boundaries between soldier and stranger, between Christian and ally from foreign lands. Historians still discuss how these nightly gatherings fostered a sense of unity that carried them through later battles. Perhaps this was how loyalty was truly forged, not on the battlefield but in shared breath beneath freezing canvas. The sounds of the night deepen around you now. Someone coughs softly. Another shifts and mutters something about home. The air smells of smoke, leather, and humanity. Beneath it all runs the steady rhythm of breathing, a communal heartbeat keeping time against the cold. You lean back slightly, feeling the weight of exhaustion pull at your eyes. The warmth is faint, but it is enough. There is a tender irony in all this. Men who had come to fight for heaven learned to survive through the simplest act of human contact. It was not divine fire that saved them most nights, but the warmth of another soul pressed near. You imagine the priest writing by candlelight, realizing the same truth as he watched them sleep, that salvation sometimes looks like two hands sharing one cloak. The wind outside stirs again, testing the seams of the tents. A few sparks leap from the nearest fire, bright and brief. Inside, bodies shift but stay close. The night belongs to the cold, but warmth has found its place. In the stillness, you sense that this shared heat is not only survival, it is a kind of quiet grace. Morning comes reluctantly, dragging a pale grey light across the camp. Frost clings to the edges of cloaks and to the ropes of the tents, turning them into delicate sculptures of ice. You rise slowly, feeling the stiffness in your joints and the ache behind your eyes. Around you, others do the same, stretching, coughing, stamping their feet to remind their blood to move again. The cold has a way of showing what the body is made of, and for the Crusaders, that lesson was written in pain. Most accounts from the period mention the toll the chill took on their health. Fingers blackened, toes cracked, and faces blistered from the bite of frozen wind. The chronicler Fulcher of Chartres described men whose breath froze inside their beards until the hair snapped like twigs. Frostbite was an invisible enemy, creeping up slowly, numbing first the skin and then the will. To keep moving was the only medicine. A curious record from a monk who travelled with the armies tells of improvised cures that sound more like acts of desperation. Soldiers rubbed snow on numb limbs to restore circulation or plunged their feet into cold water to test whether they could still feel pain. It was a crude test for life itself. Some smeared animal fat over their hands before marching, convinced it formed a magical barrier against the frost. Whether superstition or instinct, it sometimes worked well enough to make them believe. Modern scholars examining these accounts still argue about what the Crusaders knew of frostbite and hypothermia. Some believe they recognized the signs intuitively even without medical language. Others claim they confused it with divine punishment, interpreting the blackening of flesh as a mark of sin. Both views might hold a little truth, for medieval medicine often mixed faith with guesswork. An unusual note from a later chronicler describes soldiers carrying small cups of heated wine to press against their cheeks or fingertips. The warmth would fade within minutes, but for that brief time, it brought life back to their skin. You can imagine the comfort of it, that fragile relief before the wind stole it again. The same text warns, almost humorously, that those who lingered too long near fires risked burning one side of their bodies while the other stayed frozen. There was no balance, only endurance. Some experts think the constant swing between heat and cold weakened their immune systems. Fevers spread easily through the camps, carried by exhaustion, poor sanitation, and the damp ground they slept on. A single cough could turn into a lasting sickness. Yet even while fevers rose, the marches continued. A soldier too weak to stand would be loaded onto a cart if he was lucky. If not, he would be left behind with a prayer. A curious anecdote preserved in a letter to a Venetian noble tells of a surgeon who used heated stones to warm the chests of sick men, covering them with cloaks and murmured blessings. The writer swore that it saved lives, though it might simply have offered comfort. The gesture itself mattered as much as the cure. Archaeologists studying Crusader cemeteries in the Levant have found evidence of respiratory infections and joint diseases consistent with exposure to damp and cold. These findings echo the written reports, grounding the legends in human fragility. The men who dreamt of holy conquest were, in the end, bodies fighting weather as much as enemies. One forgotten manuscript hints that some soldiers believed the scent of certain herbs could ward off illness. They carried sprigs of rosemary or thyme tucked into their belts. When the wind blew, the smell mixed with the campfire smoke, filling the air with a faint, clean sharpness. Perhaps it was placebo, or perhaps it truly lifted spirits. In a world where medicine and magic often overlapped, hope itself was a remedy. You picture the morning after a freezing night, soldiers sitting around small fires, rubbing their hands, sipping broth, examining cracked skin. They joke about their misery because laughter makes the pain bearable. Behind them, a healer tends to a man whose fingers have turned grey. She hums softly as she wraps the hand in cloth warmed over the fire. The smell of burnt fabric drifts through the air. Researchers remain divided about the role of women healers in the early Crusades. Some say they were essential, others that they were rare exceptions. But the few who were there likely saved more lives than the sword ever did. They used oil, wine, and wool to dress wounds, sometimes whispering prayers as they worked. Their quiet presence was a thread of gentleness woven into the harsh fabric of war. As you breathe in the imagined cold air, you realize that every cough, every trembling hand, every scar carried a kind of nobility. These people fought not only battles of faith, but battles against their own limits. The cold stripped away pretense and left only what was real: the instinct to live, to heal, to keep moving no matter how much it hurt. The sun struggles higher, its light thin and distant, but it is enough to make the frost shimmer. The camp begins to stir again. Somewhere, a soldier laughs at the sight of his own frozen beard, snapping the ice from it like a trophy. The sound is rough but alive. Against all odds, life continues to hum beneath the frost. The air warms slightly as the sun climbs, though its light feels weak, stretched thin across the landscape. Around you, the camp begins to stir, the sound of clanking pots and creaking armor rising slowly like a morning hymn. You walk between rows of tents and notice how the soldiers' clothing looks different now. Patterns and colors that once spoke of Europe have blended with fabrics and shapes borrowed from the East. Necessity and curiosity have changed the way they dress, and perhaps the way they think. According to several surviving letters and journals, the Crusaders gradually adopted local practices to survive the unfamiliar climate. They learned that the deserts could freeze at night and burn by day, and so they sought clothing that could adjust to both extremes. Many began wearing lighter tunics of linen beneath their wool layers, a combination first seen among Syrian merchants and Bedouin travelers. The linen cooled the skin during the day, but, when covered properly, held warmth at night. Archaeologists later confirmed this adaptation through textile fragments found in former encampments, their weaving patterns clearly Middle Eastern in origin. A curious note from a chronicler writing decades after the First Crusade mentions that the soldiers called these new garments Saracen shirts, not out of insult but out of admiration. The fabric was softer, the weave tighter, and the design allowed air to circulate without losing heat. Over time, even knights who once mocked foreign habits began to copy them. Historians see this as one of the earliest examples of cultural exchange born from simple survival rather than conquest. One intriguing detail recorded by an Italian observer tells of soldiers trading their heavy European boots for leather slippers modeled after local styles. They claimed the lighter shoes kept their feet warmer by allowing movement and flexibility. The same account describes how some Crusaders began wrapping their heads in scarves or turbans against the chill wind, an idea that likely saved lives. At first, it scandalized priests who saw it as a betrayal of European identity. Yet before long, even some clerics were seen wearing them during dawn prayers. Researchers remain divided about how quickly these Eastern influences took hold. Some argue that Crusaders clung stubbornly to their old ways for years. Others believe adaptation came almost immediately, driven by sheer need. The evidence suggests both truths coexisted. Pride held fast until frostbite loosened its grip, then practicality took over. One obscure but fascinating record tells of Arab tailors traveling with the Crusader armies, repairing clothing and teaching them how to reinforce seams against cold winds. The text describes the exchange as quiet but respectful. You can imagine that scene, a tent filled with the soft rhythm of stitching, the smell of wool and oil, and two languages mingling over shared work. It is easy to forget that history is built not only by battles, but also by small acts of cooperation. There is a rumor, half believed even then, that some Crusaders began wearing undergarments soaked in vinegar, thinking it repelled insects and preserved body heat. Modern experts laugh at the idea, but it reveals how fear and folklore traveled hand in hand. What mattered was that people were experimenting, testing their limits, trying to make sense of a new world. A monk who chronicled these campaigns noted with surprise that, by the second winter, many of the Crusaders looked less like the armies that had left Europe and more like a strange hybrid between East and West. He wrote that their cloaks hung differently, their colours softened to earth tones, and their garments were trimmed with patterns inspired by local embroidery. He saw in this a kind of quiet transformation, the merging of two traditions born of hardship. Archaeological findings support his observation. Fragments of dyed textiles and metal clasps unearthed in modern Syria and Turkey show styles common to both European and Levantine craftsmen. Historians now view this blend as evidence that the Crusaders were far more adaptive than once believed. They borrowed what worked and left pride to the preachers. One curious anecdote from a soldier's memoir tells of a knight who refused to wear local garments until one freezing night forced him to accept a wool-lined robe offered by an Armenian guide. The next morning, he declared it a divine invention and swore he would never remove it again. His companions teased him, but by the following week, half his unit had found similar robes. Change often begins with one man too cold to care about appearances. Even the colours of the camp shifted. Early Crusader banners of bright red and white faded to browns, tans, and deep blues borrowed from local dyes. The wind carried scents of new cloth, olive oil, and foreign spices from the markets where these materials were bought or bartered. The mingling of cultures was not polite or planned. It was survival written into fabric. As the sun dips lower again, the chill returns. You pull your imagined cloak tighter and feel the blend of textures against your skin, the roughness of European wool layered with the smooth linen of the East. It is soft where it once scratched, strong where it once tore. The Crusaders learned this too, that warmth could be found not only in the fire, but in the wisdom of those who had faced the same cold long before them. The evening wind whispers through the camp, rustling the newly mended garments hanging to dry. Each one tells a story of change, of pride surrendered to practicality, of two worlds stitched together by needle, thread, and the will to endure. The camp quiets again as dusk gathers, the last light turning the tents to faint shapes in the haze. You notice how some glow with steady firelight, while others stand cold and dark. Inside each one, lives unfold in vastly different ways. A knight reclines on a cushion of folded cloaks, sipping warm wine from a pewter cup. A peasant soldier outside gnaws on stale bread, his back pressed to the same earth that chills his bones. The same crusade, the same cold, yet two very different worlds. According to most chronicles, the divide between noble and common soldier was clear, even when frost blurred everything else. Knights brought supply wagons filled with spare clothes, bedding, and servants who could fetch wood or tend the fire. They sometimes owned tents large enough to host small councils, lined with fabric thick enough to hold warmth. Meanwhile, the common men slept under thin canvas or open sky, sharing straw and shivering through the long hours. Still, both woke with the same frozen breath on their lips. A curious letter from a squire named Alain describes how his master's tent had rugs taken from a merchant caravan. The rugs were coarse, but luxurious compared to bare ground. Alain wrote that when his master slept, the servants curled at the edges of the rugs to catch the leftover warmth that escaped from the knight's body. That detail, small and human, says more about the social order than any sermon ever could. Archaeological evidence from Crusader camps supports this uneven comfort. Remains of decorated tent poles, bronze buckles, and fragments of embroidered cloth appear alongside crude iron nails and plain leather scraps. Scholars use these finds to paint a vivid picture of hierarchy surviving even in hardship. Some experts note that, in the coldest conditions, the noble tents acted as centers of warmth for the camp, with servants constantly fetching coals to feed the fires inside. One strange detail recorded by a chronicler from the Second Crusade claims that certain knights paid peasants with food or coin to sleep beside their tents as windbreaks. The image feels absurd, almost cruel, but perhaps it was simply another form of trade in a world where warmth was the only true currency. Whether it actually happened or not remains uncertain, but the story reflects how power shaped even the simplest acts of survival. Researchers continue to debate how deeply class distinction influenced morale. Some argue that shared danger softened the divisions between ranks. Others insist that resentment simmered quietly beneath the surface, waiting to ignite. A monk, writing after the siege of Antioch, observed that hunger and cold made all men equal by dawn, yet pride returned with daylight. His words ring true, even now. One peculiar record speaks of a knight who, out of pity or loneliness, invited a handful of foot soldiers to share his tent during a snowstorm. They ate, drank, and prayed together until morning. When the storm passed, the soldiers refused to leave, joking that their loyalty was now sealed by shared warmth. The tale became a kind of legend, told as proof that mercy could survive even in war. Whether it truly happened or not, you can imagine the glow of that tent against the frozen dark. Not all nobles were so generous. Some chroniclers mention fights over firewood, where squires of wealthy lords drove off common men trying to steal logs. Others describe tents guarded at night to keep desperate soldiers from crowding too close to the heat. Yet occasionally, necessity forced unity. When a storm tore through the camp or frost threatened to kill, the barriers between ranks dissolved like ice under flame. For a few hours, everyone breathed the same cold and prayed for the same dawn. A forgotten fragment from a Byzantine source records a curious habit among the Crusaders. Nobles often carried scented oils or spices to mask the smell of damp wool and smoke. The poorer soldiers teased them, calling them perfumed pilgrims. Ironically, the oils sometimes helped, coating the skin against dryness and frost. In trying to preserve their dignity, the knights may have stumbled upon a small form of protection that peasants later copied. When you walk through the camp in your imagination, you can feel both the distance and the closeness between these people. The tents of the rich glow softly, laughter drifting from inside. Outside, near the smaller fires, men speak in low tones, their faces shadowed but alive. A peasant strums a crude lute. A knight, passing by, pauses to listen before moving on. The cold binds them in silence that neither gold nor title can escape. Historians today often remark that the Crusades were as much about endurance as they were about faith. The cold tested everyone equally, but it revealed character differently. Wealth gave advantage, but it could not buy sleep without fear. Strength gave courage, but not always comfort. The frost respected no one, and that truth, repeated every night, was perhaps the greatest equalizer of all. You stop for a moment and picture the final hours before dawn. The fires burn low, and the nobles' tents stand still while the common men huddle under threadbare blankets. The wind sighs across both without favour, and though the gulf between them remains, the same breath of frost touches all. In that shared suffering, for just a heartbeat of history, they are the same. Night arrives like a slow tide, pulling the last traces of light from the horizon. The camp grows quiet again, except for the occasional jingle of chainmail or the soft clop of a horse shifting its weight. A few figures move through the dimness, cloaked and cautious. These are the sentries, the ones who must stay awake when everyone else sleeps. Their task is simple to name and difficult to survive, to guard the living against both enemies and the cold. According to the accounts of several Crusader chroniclers, the watch was dreaded almost as much as battle. Standing still for hours in the open night drained the body faster than any march. The sentries wrapped themselves in every layer they owned, cloaks doubled and hoods drawn tight. Some stuffed straw inside their sleeves or boots, desperate to trap the smallest trace of heat. Even so, frost would creep up from the ground, numbing the feet first, then the fingers, and finally the will. A letter written by a Norman knight describes the trick of constant motion. He wrote that a good sentry never stopped pacing, circling his post in slow, measured steps to keep his blood moving. Those who stood still too long were found stiff by morning. It is a grim image, but one echoed in other records. To walk was to live, to rest was to freeze. Archaeological surveys of known Crusader sites have uncovered shallow trenches around the perimeters of old camps, sometimes lined with stones blackened by fire. Historians believe these were guard stations, small shelters where sentries could crouch beside coals for a moment's warmth before continuing their patrol. The traces tell of exhaustion written into the ground itself. One curious note from a later chronicler claims that the guards carried little bells on their belts so that officers could hear movement in the dark and know they were still alive. The idea might be more poetic than practical, but it captures the loneliness of those nights. Imagine the faint jingle echoing across the silent plain, proof that someone still endured. Experts remain divided on how much discipline governed these night watches. Some argue that the armies enforced strict rotations, each man taking his turn with military precision. Others believe it was chaos, a constant shifting of volunteers and bribes. One soldier might pay another with a piece of bread or a promise of favor to take his place. The cold made men inventive in their excuses. A curious fragment from a Byzantine observer describes how the sentries would carry small candles hidden behind their shields, using the light to watch for movement in the dark. The flame was precious, both comfort and risk. A gust of wind could snuff it out, while a distant eye might see it flicker and mark the camp's position. To hold a candle in such a night was to balance fear against hope. There is an old superstition mentioned in a monk's travel diary that says a watchfire left unattended invited wandering spirits. The guards, perhaps half in jest, muttered prayers as they fed the flames, speaking to the fire as if it were a living thing. "Stay with us," one wrote in the margins of his psalter, "for we cannot stay awake without you." That simple plea carries through time, a human voice trembling in the dark. Every sound carried far on those frozen nights. A snapping twig, a rustling tent, the distant cry of a wolf. It all seemed amplified by the emptiness. The sentries learned to read the language of noise. The wind had one tone, animals another, and human footsteps something else entirely. To mistake one for the other could mean disaster. One strange but recurring detail in multiple reports describes guards warming their hands over the barrels of their spears or swords, as if the metal could absorb heat by will alone. It is almost childlike in its futility, yet deeply human in its persistence. When everything around you is frozen, even false warmth is better than none. Modern historians see the watch as a symbol of endurance, the moment where survival and discipline merged. To remain vigilant while the cold pressed close required not courage but devotion to the smallest tasks. Another step, another glance at the shadows, another whispered prayer. You can picture it now, a lone figure outlined against the dull glow of the fire, eyes searching the horizon that never changes. As the hours drag on, the sky thickens with cloud, and the world feels narrow and endless all at once. The sentry stamps his boots, blows into his hands, and mutters that dawn will never come. But it always does, eventually. When the first light touches the camp, he walks back among the sleepers, stiff with fatigue but alive. Around him the fires crackle again, smoke rising into pale air. In that moment, you understand the quiet heroism of staying awake. The Crusaders feared enemies and death, but they also feared the cold that could claim them silently. The watchfires of fear, burning low and steady through the night, were not symbols of courage alone, they were acts of survival, small flames against an indifferent sky. The fire has burned down to embers again. You stare at the faint orange glow, the ashes breathing in small pulses like the slow heartbeat of the camp. All around you, the sound of sleep fills the air, uneven and fragile. The wind slides between the tents, lifting flaps and whispering through the straw. Somewhere in that quiet, you begin to understand the moment every crusader feared most, the instant when the fire dies and the cold begins its slow return. Contemporary sources describe these nights as the true test of faith. A campfire could not burn forever, and once it faded, the dark became almost physical. Soldiers felt it pressing in, swallowing sound and warmth together. Even the stars seemed to hide. In that suffocating silence, the cold became an enemy with its own voice, creaking through frozen ropes, sighing across the canvas. A knight from Champagne wrote that it sounded like the breath of the dead come back to listen. A curious note from another chronicler tells of how men would talk to the ashes, coaxing them as though the fire were a living friend refusing to wake. They would whisper promises, pray softly, or feed the coals with splinters of wood taken from broken arrows. The practice might have been half superstition, half comfort. Historians today see it as proof of the human need to keep dialogue, even with inanimate hope. The temperature dropped hardest just before dawn. Those who survived long marches knew this well and prepared accordingly. They layered every scrap of fabric they could find, pulled hoods tight, and lay so still that they seemed carved from stone. Those who failed to prepare often woke too late, encased in frost like statues. Archaeologists have unearthed graves from these expeditions where the bodies show no signs of battle, only the posture of men who simply fell asleep and never woke. Experts continue to discuss whether exhaustion or frostbite claimed more Crusader lives during the winter campaigns. The records do not distinguish clearly between the two. What they do make clear is that morale froze as quickly as flesh. One priest described walking through the camp after midnight, hearing faint murmurs from within tents, prayers half spoken before turning to shivers. He wrote that the silence which followed frightened him more than any sound. One curious tradition, preserved in a few letters, was that of the ember guard. When the fire dimmed too low, a soldier would scoop a handful of glowing ash into a small pot or helmet, cover it with sand, and carry it to another tent to rekindle warmth. The same ember might move through 10 shelters in one night, traded hand to hand like sacred light. Whether practical or symbolic, it turned the act of survival into a quiet ceremony of sharing. A peculiar rumor from a later crusade claims that some soldiers swore the dying fires spoke to them. They said the cracking wood carried voices sometimes of loved ones, sometimes of saints. Modern scholars dismiss it as a trick of exhaustion, the brain conjuring comfort where none existed. Yet you can imagine it, the lonely hour, the hiss of cooling embers, the mind-seeking company in sound. The cold changed everything it touched. Metal grew brittle, leather stiffened, and even bread turned to stone. The air inside the tents froze moisture into glittering frost on the canvas. Men wrapped their faces in cloth to breathe warmer air, their exhalations freezing in thin white webs. One chronicler described how even whispers turned visible, drifting away like smoke. In that fragile stillness, time seemed to stop. You can picture yourself sitting there, knees drawn close, staring into what remains of the fire. The last spark fades, and for a moment, all sense of direction disappears. The sky and earth become one dark shape. The camp feels suspended between worlds, between sleep and death. It is not terror that grips you, but a strange acceptance. This too is part of survival, the learning to be still inside the cold. A forgotten monk wrote that on some nights, when the fires went out and no one could sleep, a few soldiers would rise quietly and walk among the tents, whispering to one another that dawn was near, even if it was not. The phrase became a sort of mantra: dawn will come. To repeat it was to push the darkness a little farther away. When the first faint light finally returns, it does not feel warm. It is pale, grey, and slow, but it is life. Men stretch stiff arms, stamp their boots, and laugh at how close they came to freezing. They feed the embers with new wood and watch the flames crawl upward again. The fire crackles, smoke rises, and colour returns to the world. You realize then that the fire's death was never the true danger. The real battle was in the waiting, in believing that warmth would return. The Crusaders learned to survive not by defeating the cold but by outlasting it. One breath, one ember, one whispered hope at a time. The morning light feels fragile, as though it could shatter if you breathe too loudly. The camp stirs in silence, the cold still clinging to every edge. You look around and see men rubbing their hands, whispering prayers, and kissing the small wooden crosses that hang from their necks. Out here, faith is more than belief. It is fuel, the only fire that burns without wood. According to most Crusader chronicles, prayer filled the hours when cold made action impossible. Before dawn and after dusk, soldiers gathered in quiet circles, their breath rising in clouds as they murmured Latin hymns. It was a rhythm that steadied them, a way to push back against the emptiness of the night. One chronicler wrote that prayer warmed the heart when the body failed. Perhaps that was not just a metaphor. A curious letter from a priest marching with the army tells how he saw men clasping their rosaries so tightly that the beads left marks on their palms. He claimed that these imprints were signs of grace, proof that faith could leave warmth in the flesh. Historians today interpret the image differently, suggesting that men needed something to focus on, something to hold while waiting for daylight. Whether miracle or coping mechanism, the act brought comfort. There are many tales of relics carried through the Crusades, splinters said to be from the true cross, vials of oil, fragments of bone wrapped in silk. These were not only spiritual treasures but psychological shields. A knight who believed that a saint watched over him could endure cold that would break another man. Archaeological evidence even supports this habit. Small reliquary pendants have been unearthed near known Crusader camps, the metal worn smooth from constant handling. A strange account written by an Italian pilgrim claims that soldiers sometimes placed relics near campfires, asking for divine heat. The author calls it foolish, yet you can sense tenderness in the description. The firelight, reflecting on silver and bone, must have seemed like heaven answering, if only for a moment. The line between faith and superstition blurred easily when frost crept into every tent. Experts remain divided about how deeply religion sustained morale during these harsh winters. Some argue that belief gave the men purpose strong enough to endure anything. Others point to moments of despair recorded in letters, when faith seemed to flicker as faintly as the coals. Perhaps both are true. The human spirit rarely moves in straight lines. It bends, wavers, and then stands again. A lesser-known anecdote describes a monk who walked the camp each evening, blessing each tent with a branch dipped in wine instead of holy water, because the real thing froze too quickly. The men loved him for it, calling him Father Frost. Even skeptics knelt when he passed. The ritual smelled faintly of sweetness and smoke, a sensory reminder that they were still part of something larger than themselves. One chronicler from the Second Crusade noted that men often prayed not for victory, but for warmth. He wrote, "The cold was the sharper sword, and we begged God to blunt its edge." His phrasing carries quiet poetry, the kind born from exhaustion. You can almost hear his voice, cracked from the wind, reciting words into the night. A curious practice recorded in several accounts involves communal chanting. When the cold became unbearable, groups of men would gather near a central fire and chant hymns together. The singing served both faith and physics. Voices kept them breathing deeply, and the movement of air in their chests helped maintain warmth. One soldier swore the hymns lit heat in the ribs. Whether literal or not, the sound alone could ward off despair. Modern scholars studying these patterns of devotion sometimes note that the line between spiritual warmth and emotional solidarity was nearly invisible. To believe was to connect. When hundreds of men whispered the same words into the dark, the act itself built a kind of invisible shelter around them. Faith, like flame, spread through proximity. There is a fragment from a forgotten Latin sermon delivered during a freezing march. The priest said, "The Lord's fire is not seen but felt, and it moves through you as breath moves through frost." The soldiers remembered those words long after the sermon ended. Even now, you can repeat them softly to yourself and feel how they fit the scene. The wind still prowls outside the tents, but inside, the murmured prayers fill the air like soft music. The faces around the fire glow faintly, eyes closed, lips moving slowly. Whether they speak to God or to their own endurance, the effect is the same. Warmth stirs again. Faith did not stop the frost from forming, nor did it heal cracked skin or aching bones. Yet it gave them the strength to face the next night, the next march, the next breath. You sense it even now, the quiet resilience that lives between one prayer and the next. In that fragile space, the cold retreats a little, and the heart, for a while, forgets to tremble. The day wears on quietly. Smoke curls from small fires, drifting upward into a sky as pale as worn linen. The camp hums with low voices, the shuffle of boots, the clink of tools. You notice how the men's clothing has changed again, a patchwork of colours and textures that no longer belong to one world. Where once every soldier dressed in heavy European wool, now linen, silk, and cotton mingle with it, foreign threads stitched by necessity. The cold has not disappeared, but the Crusaders have learned to face it with new wisdom gathered from those who knew the land before them. Contemporary records mention that traders from the East sold or gifted garments to the Crusaders, introducing them to fabrics that felt strange yet practical. Silk, though costly, proved surprisingly useful. It trapped heat close to the skin and resisted moisture better than rough wool. One chronicler described how a knight, skeptical at first, admitted that a layer of silk beneath his armor felt like a second warmth of the body. Archaeological evidence later confirmed that fragments of silk and fine linen were found in Crusader burial sites, a sign that practicality often overcame pride. A curious report from a Byzantine observer recalls that the Crusaders marveled at the desert dwellers who wore layered robes instead of heavy coats. The locals explained that still air trapped between the layers formed insulation. This simple principle impressed the soldiers, who began sewing extra folds into their tunics. Some historians even suggest that the fashion for quilted clothing in later centuries may have its distant roots in these early adaptations. One odd yet revealing detail appears in a letter written by a French squire who noted how his comrades began wearing long scarves wrapped around their necks and faces at night. He said it made them look like the heathens, but he admitted that it kept the frost from biting. Scholars find humor in the contrast between disdain and imitation, proof that survival often humbles belief. Experts remain divided on how willingly Crusaders embraced these foreign influences. Some claim they resisted, fearing contamination of their Christian identity. Others argue that daily suffering dissolved such boundaries quickly. Evidence suggests that adaptation spread first among the lower ranks, who traded and mingled more freely with locals. Nobles followed slowly, but by the second winter, even they could be seen wrapped in Eastern cloaks, coloured in soft blues and browns instead of the stark tones of Europe. One obscure anecdote mentions a group of Flemish knights who tried to copy Turkish fur-lined boots, but used sheep wool instead of fox or goat. The result, according to the chronicler, was comfort for a single night and disaster the next, as the wool soaked up dew and froze solid. The story still circulates among historians as an example of trial and error at its most human. Trade with local markets became a quiet lifeline. Crusaders bought or bartered for cotton cloth, sheepskin, or felted hats, learning from merchants who had mastered the art of keeping warmth in thin air. The camps smelled of new fabrics and foreign dyes, mixed with the smoke of cooking fires. At first, this scent reminded them of strangeness, but eventually it became the smell of survival itself. A lesser-known traveller's journal describes how Eastern tailors began to follow the crusading armies, repairing clothes and teaching soldiers to mend their own garments. The author writes of seeing a line of men waiting patiently by lamplight, their cloaks spread out on the ground as tailors patched them with colourful scraps. Those bits of colour must have stood out against the dust and frost, small sparks of life stitched into the bleakness. There was resistance too. Some priests condemned the wearing of local dress, calling it a temptation toward vanity or sin. Yet even they were seen, by the end of one harsh winter, wearing fur-lined gloves bought from Muslim traders. Survival softened dogma faster than argument ever could. Modern textile historians studying this period note that the blending of European and Middle Eastern materials left a permanent mark on fashion. Techniques of layering, the use of quilted linings, and even the idea of the hooded cloak spread through returning Crusaders into later medieval Europe. The cold had taught them to innovate, but it was cultural exchange that gave those innovations shape. You picture the camp now in its full transformation. Soldiers moving through fog, their clothing flowing and layered, their silhouettes less rigid, more fluid. The colours are muted but warm, the fabrics rustling softly instead of clanking like metal. They look less like invaders and more like wanderers who have learned to listen to the land. As evening falls again, a breeze moves through the tents, lifting the edges of those hybrid garments and making them flutter like banners of peace rather than war. You can almost hear the quiet acceptance in the air. The cold remains, patient and impartial, but the Crusaders no longer meet it as strangers. Wrapped in the knowledge of others, they have learned that survival sometimes begins with humility, the kind that allows one to borrow wisdom from those once called enemies. The fires flicker back to life, and the night glows with the soft hues of woven fabrics catching the light. Around you, the camp breathes easily. In this mingling of textures, threads, and warmth, you can feel history stitching itself together, one patient seam at a time. The sky fades to a bruised violet, and the wind carries the sharp smell of distant snow. Tonight, you walk among men who have learned to read the weather like scripture. They know the sound of frost forming on grass, the shift in the wind that means a river will freeze by dawn. These are lessons written not in books but in aching bones. When the Crusaders marched through winter landscapes, the cold became their constant adversary, shaping every movement, every strategy, every breath. According to most chronicles, the Crusaders were woefully unprepared for the winters of Asia Minor and the Balkans. They had imagined endless heat, not mountains rimed in ice or rivers hard as glass. Yet, the march never paused. One chronicler wrote that the sound of frozen ground under boots was like walking across broken bells. The noise followed them, echoing between valleys. They were not only fighting enemies but the seasons themselves. A curious note from an anonymous observer during the siege of Antioch describes an army halted by a frozen river that cracked like thunder beneath their carts. The men chopped at the surface with axes to test its strength, and when it broke, one horse fell through, vanishing with a scream that haunted them for days. The chronicler called it a warning from the Lord. Historians now see it as a reminder that nature, more than any foe, determined the pace of war. One forgotten diary kept by a knight from Burgundy reveals how they adapted to the frozen terrain. He wrote of scattering ashes and straw over the ice to give footing to soldiers and horses alike. Archaeologists later found remnants of straw and burnt residue near an ancient ford in Anatolia, confirming that his account was more than metaphor. It is one of the few physical traces of ingenuity born from desperation. Experts continue to discuss how these winter marches reshaped Crusader tactics. Some claim that the cold forced cooperation between rival factions because survival outweighed politics. Others argue that it deepened division, as those with supplies hoarded them against the poor. Both sides may be right. The cold has a way of revealing the best and worst in people. A peculiar anecdote from a Genoese traveller speaks of soldiers wrapping cloth around their weapons to keep metal from freezing to their hands. He described it as a strange sight: blades swaddled like infants, spears bound with scraps of linen. The same man noted that armor sometimes froze to the skin after crossing icy streams. To remove it required pouring warm wine over the joints, a luxury most could not afford. The march through frozen fields left scars even on the land. Contemporary sources mention abandoned wagons half buried in snow, their wheels frozen solid. Horses fell and were stripped for leather before their bodies stiffened. The silence of those plains must have been unbearable, a soundless world where breath steamed like smoke and footsteps vanished without echo. One chronicler recorded a strange miracle near the city of Marash. The army, desperate for water, found a stream that had frozen clear and solid. They broke through the ice, and beneath it, fish still swam lazily in the current. The men took it as a divine sign and called the place the River of Living Glass. Scholars today doubt the story but appreciate its poetry. In the midst of hunger and frostbite, faith gave shape to beauty where little could be found. There is another curious detail in a soldier's report from the Second Crusade. He claimed that snowstorms sometimes saved them from ambushes by blinding enemy scouts. The same storms, however, buried their fires and froze their provisions. To light a flame in those conditions meant kneeling in the snow, cupping the spark like a prayer. You can almost feel that moment: the shivering hands, the faint glow reflected in the snow, the stubborn refusal to surrender to darkness. Archaeological traces found in the passes of the Taurus Mountains show fragments of metal buckles, cooking pots, and horseshoes scattered across the terrain. Many were bent or broken, as if abandoned mid-march. The evidence matches written descriptions of men forced to leave their belongings behind when the cold made carrying them impossible. The mountains became both graveyard and monument to human endurance. Modern historians often describe these winter marches as the crucible of the crusading experience. They stripped away illusion and left only survival. The holy purpose faded into something simpler and more honest: the will to keep walking. You can picture the line of figures trudging through snow, their cloaks stiff, their breath forming halos around their faces. Behind them, the frozen landscape stretches silent and endless. Ahead, a faint hope glimmers like the promise of spring. When night falls again, the camp glows faintly beneath the stars, fires flickering against snowbanks. The men huddle closer than before, sharing warmth and stories of the day's march. The cold presses in but cannot quite win. The wind howls across the plain, but the fires answer, crackling like small defiances in the dark. In that rhythm, the hiss of flame, the whistle of wind, the murmur of human voices, you hear the heartbeat of endurance itself. The air grows thinner as you climb a low ridge, the ground crunching underfoot like powdered glass. Around you, the camp is a hive of activity. Men are busy digging shallow pits, stacking stones, and dragging wooden shields into odd positions. It takes a moment to understand what you are seeing. These are not preparations for battle, but small acts of engineering meant to tame the cold. The Crusaders, once helpless before the elements, have learned to fight back with their hands and their wits. Most medieval records agree that the soldiers became astonishingly inventive during the harsh winters of their campaigns. They dug trenches around tents to block the wind, built earthen mounds behind fires to reflect heat inward, and sometimes even constructed makeshift ovens out of clay and brick scavenged from ruins. The same men who once struggled to start a spark now shaped the earth to hold it. One curious passage in the writings of a Byzantine observer describes a scene where a group of soldiers cut their shields into curved panels to form a semicircle behind a fire. The wood, darkened by battle scars, reflected the heat like a mirror. According to the writer, they called this contraption the Knight's Hearth. Archaeologists later uncovered scorched wood fragments matching such descriptions near the site of an old winter encampment. Another soldier, writing to his family in France, told how they used helmets filled with hot stones to warm their tents. The method was simple. Heat the stones beside the fire until they glowed faintly, then carry them inside using bits of cloth to avoid burns. Placed beneath cloaks or under straw bedding, the stones released slow, steady warmth through the night. Modern historians call this the earliest recorded form of field heating. Experts continue to discuss whether these innovations spread from Eastern traditions or were born from necessity. Some claim that Crusaders borrowed techniques from local villagers accustomed to cold desert nights. Others believe such ideas arose spontaneously among weary soldiers trying anything that worked. Whatever their origin, these small adjustments turned survival from chance into craft. A curious note found in a later chronicle mentions that soldiers even redirected smoke from campfires by digging narrow trenches, creating vents that carried heat into sleeping spaces without filling them with fumes. The system resembled primitive chimneys, a design centuries ahead of its time. To imagine these rough warriors bending over the earth, shaping it with purpose, is to see them not as conquerors but as artisans of endurance. There is also the story of an anonymous carpenter from Burgundy who built what one chronicler called a wall of warmth. He constructed a windbreak of woven branches covered in mud, drying it by the fire until it hardened into something like clay. Behind this barrier, the men slept in relative comfort, protected from the biting wind. Though scholars debate the truth of the account, they agree that such ingenuity reflects a mind sharpened by necessity. A lesser-known but touching account describes how soldiers melted animal fat to seal cracks in their tents, the smell unpleasant but effective. When the wind howled outside, they joked that the odor of roasted lamb kept away spirits of the frost. Humor, even of the roughest kind, served as another form of insulation. Modern military historians see in these habits the roots of organized field engineering. Simple as they were, these techniques reveal a transformation, from an army lost in the wilderness to one capable of mastering its environment. A knight's courage might falter before a sword, but not before the satisfaction of seeing his shelter hold against a storm. The cold forged creativity just as battle forged courage. You picture the camp glowing like a city of small fortresses, each tent reinforced, each fire carefully shielded. The air smells of clay, smoke, and damp wool. Sparks rise like fireflies into the dark, and behind the lines of shields, men stretch their hands toward the reflected warmth, sighing with relief. Even the sound of the wind has changed. It no longer screams through the camp unchecked, but breaks into fragments, softened by walls and pits and human design. The night feels less hostile now, the air less predatory. It is still cold, yes, but the Crusaders have learned to carve warmth out of it. When dawn comes, frost clings to the barricades, glittering like tiny jewels. The soldiers emerge, yawning but alive. Their tools are crude, their shelters rough, yet each one stands as a small monument to persistence. You realize that survival here is not an accident but a slow, deliberate art, shaped by minds that refuse to surrender to the elements. The sun climbs higher, melting a thin layer of ice from the camp's edge. Smoke curls lazily upward, carrying the scent of life renewed. You watch as a soldier lifts his shield from the wall he built and smiles at the warmth trapped beneath it. In that small smile lies the essence of resilience, the quiet victory of hands that refuse to freeze idle. The sun dips low, staining the sky in golden smoke. A faint hum of voices rises through the camp. Tonight, the cold is met not only with fire but with laughter and song. You can smell the bitter tang of ale, the sweetness of spiced wine, the scent of roasted grain. The Crusaders have learned another kind of warmth, one that burns from inside the heart instead of the hearth. According to surviving letters and chronicles, drink was both medicine and morale for these armies. Wine and ale were safer than water, often diluted and warmed over the fire. Soldiers believed it strengthened their blood against the cold. In truth, it did little more than numb their fingers and cheer their spirits, but that was enough. A chronicler from the First Crusade wrote that a cup shared in frost is holier than gold. A curious entry in a knight's diary from the siege of Antioch describes how the men mixed wine with honey and herbs. He called it liquid courage against the winter. Historians believe this may have been an early form of mulled wine, borrowed from Eastern recipes. Whatever its origin, the steaming cups became a nightly ritual, passed from hand to hand like communion. Music followed wherever drink appeared. The sound of lutes and flutes drifted through the tents, mingling with laughter and off-key singing. Men pounded rhythm on shields, stomped their boots, and sang songs of home until their voices cracked. A few chroniclers mention that commanders sometimes frowned on the noise, fearing it might reveal their position, yet few dared silence it completely. The songs kept despair at bay. One lesser-known story tells of a Templar knight who carried a small harp through the campaigns. On cold nights he played soft melodies, while others huddled around the fire. A monk who witnessed this scene wrote that the sound melted frost as surely as flame. Perhaps he exaggerated, but you can feel the truth of it. The mind, when warmed by music, forgets the cold for a while. Researchers still debate how organized these evenings of music and drink were. Some describe them as moments of chaos, drunken brawls, and broken cups. Others believe they were structured gatherings, with leaders encouraging songs of faith and fellowship. Either way, they served the same purpose: to remind men that life still held pleasure. A strange note from an anonymous chronicler mentions soldiers heating stones in the fire, dropping them into wine jugs to keep the drink warm. The hissing steam filled the tents, and the smell of boiled spice and fruit carried through the camp. It must have felt like luxury, that fleeting illusion of comfort against the cold. Archaeologists have found clay fragments scorched in ways that match this description, silent proof of the moment's reality. The laughter that rose from those gatherings had its own rhythm. Some told stories of battles fought, others of foolish escapades from home. The tales grew wilder as the wine deepened. A knight became a saint in his own story, and a farmer became a hero who had once wrestled a bear in Burgundy. The fire cracked, the knight leaned close, and for a few hours war seemed far away. One chronicler from the later Crusades recorded that songs changed with the temperature. On warmer nights, men sang of glory. In the frost, their voices turned toward love and home. You can hear it in your imagination now. A dozen voices carrying across the wind, rough but sincere, like prayer made human. Experts note that these moments of celebration were not frivolous but vital. Laughter and song kept the mind from freezing long before the body did. Without them, discipline faltered. Modern psychologists would call it morale, but to the Crusaders, it was something simpler. It was the act of remembering they were still alive. As the night deepens, the camp becomes a mosaic of small fires, each surrounded by circles of glowing faces. Some men sing, others sleep, others simply watch the sparks rise into the dark. The air trembles with music and murmured prayer, blending into something larger than either. It is the sound of endurance disguised as joy. When the last song fades, the silence that follows is softer, kinder. The cold returns, but the men are changed. Their cheeks glow, their hearts beat stronger, their minds drift toward dreams instead of fear. Somewhere in that space between laughter and sleep, humanity survives another night. By the next morning, the camp smells faintly of smoke and damp earth. The fires have burned low, and thin grey trails of ash snake upward into the sky. You watch as a few men crouch beside the dying embers, stirring them carefully with bits of wood. They are not only tending flames, they are managing life itself. The Crusaders learned quickly that the secret to warmth was not just fire but smoke. Contemporary accounts describe how soldiers experimented with controlling smoke to make their shelters more livable. A simple campfire in a tent could choke a man before it warmed him, so they began shaping small vents, cutting holes in the canvas, or tilting the tent's edge just enough for the fumes to escape. It was primitive ventilation, born from necessity. Archaeologists have found charred tent stakes and smoke-stained stones that match these descriptions, quiet evidence of their learning. A curious letter from a monk who travelled with the armies mentions how he watched soldiers arrange fires in pairs, placing their tents between them so the smoke rose on both sides. He called the design a corridor of warmth. Historians believe this technique helped reduce the bitter winds that swept across open plains. What began as improvisation slowly turned into habit. Another chronicler tells an almost unbelievable story of a knight who claimed to read weather from smoke. He would watch the direction it drifted and predict storms or frost. Modern scholars dismiss it as superstition, but the image is striking. A man studying the behavior of fire as if it spoke a language known only to the desperate. In a way, perhaps it did. Experts continue to discuss how these small innovations changed the way medieval armies understood shelter. Before the Crusades, fire was often kept outside sleeping spaces. By the end of the campaigns, soldiers had learned to integrate it safely, transforming their tents into crude hearth homes. Some historians argue this knowledge eventually influenced field architecture in Europe. Others insist it was forgotten until rediscovered centuries later. The evidence remains thin but evocative. A lesser-known note from a chronicler in the Third Crusade describes a group of soldiers digging shallow trenches around their fires, not only to block the wind but to channel smoke into the ground. The soil filtered the air, letting heat rise more cleanly. You can almost see it. Men bent over their work, hands raw from frost, finding beauty in simple geometry. The smell of smoke clings to everything, cloaks, hair, and breath, but no one complains. It is the scent of life continuing. One curious anecdote claims that on particularly cold nights, soldiers deliberately let their fires smolder instead of burn, producing more smoke than flame. They believed thick smoke sealed warmth beneath the tents like a blanket. It might have been miserable to breathe, but the trick worked. When morning came, frost covered the ground outside, while inside remained barely thawed. Survival rarely smells pleasant. Modern researchers examining residues from ancient camps have identified layers of soot compacted into the soil, suggesting that fires were indeed kept low and smoky. These traces align with written descriptions of men who valued endurance over comfort. The ingenuity of their smokecraft may not have been elegant, but it kept them breathing through the coldest nights. There is something meditative in the thought of those slow-burning fires. You can imagine the soft hiss of damp wood, the drifting tendrils of smoke weaving through the air like thin ghosts. The glow is faint, but steady. The air smells harsh, yet strangely calming. Even the act of tending smoke becomes a kind of ritual, a way to remind oneself that warmth can be managed, not just prayed for. A monk's journal from the siege of Jerusalem mentions how the scent of burning oak mixed with incense from the priest's prayers at dawn, creating what he called holy breath. He believed the rising smoke carried the suffering of the soldiers to heaven. Whether that is faith or poetry, it captures the truth that fire, in its many forms, became both tool and symbol. As night falls again, the camp glows faintly under a haze of smoke. The air feels heavier but gentler now. Men move slowly through it, eyes watering, faces ruddy from the heat. Somewhere, someone hums a tune, half lost in the hum of the fire. You realize that this strange mastery of smoke was more than a survival tactic. It was a philosophy. The Crusaders learned that not all warmth shines brightly. Some warmth hides, lingers, and moves quietly through the dark, carrying life in its soft grey arms. The last embers sigh and dim, yet the warmth clings to the air. The tents breathe, the smoke curls upward, and the night accepts it all. In that moment, the cold feels less cruel. as if the world itself is exhaling along with them. The morning after a smoky night smells of ash, leather, and something faintly sweet. A new sound cuts through the calm, the gentle rustle of fur. You turn and see soldiers wrapped in heavy cloaks lined with animal skins, their movements slower but more comfortable. The sight feels strangely regal in the grey light. Fur has become their armour against the cold, as valuable as any sword or shield. According to most chronicles, furs were among the most coveted materials during the winter campaigns. They came in many kinds: wolf, fox, sheep, and goat for the common soldiers, sable, marten, or ermine for those who could afford luxury. The difference between a man who froze and a man who survived often lay in the thickness of his collar. Trade in furs became a hidden economy of the Crusades, an exchange of warmth rather than wealth. A curious passage in a merchant's ledger found near the port of Acre lists hundreds of furs sold to Crusaders at inflated prices. It notes that even poor pilgrims bartered weapons or horses just to buy scraps of hide. The ledger reads less like business and more like confession, a record of desperation measured in pelts. Archaeologists later confirmed these transactions by finding remnants of fur fibers in burial sites, their texture still visible under the microscope. One forgotten traveller's diary recounts how soldiers learned from Armenian and Turkish traders to soften stiff hides by rubbing them with oil and ash. The process kept the fur pliable and prevented cracking in the frost. The diary adds, almost admiringly, that the smell was fierce, but so was the comfort. Historians suspect such methods spread quickly through the ranks, shared quietly from camp to camp. Experts remain divided on whether fur was considered practical or prestigious among Crusaders. Some argue it symbolized status, especially when dyed in bright colors or trimmed with embroidery. Others claim it was merely a tool of survival, stripped of meaning by the elements. The truth, as usual, lies between. A noble might wear fur for display, but he thanked it like a friend when the wind howled across the plains. There is an odd story told in a Latin letter about knights who wore furs inside out to trap heat better, only to be mocked by comrades for looking like wild men. By the following week, everyone had done the same. That small act of imitation shows how quickly pride yielded to experience. Survival was the great teacher, and even vanity listened to it. A lesser-known but striking account tells of traders bringing northern furs from Scandinavia and Russia, their softness prized even in the East. These furs travelled farther than the Crusaders themselves, linking frozen forests to desert camps. The idea that warmth crossed continents long before peace did is both ironic and comforting. One curious discovery made by modern archaeologists in the ruins of a Crusader fort near Jerusalem revealed scraps of fur-lined leather sewn into armor padding. This suggests that fur was not only worn for comfort but used as insulation under metal plates. The combination would have softened the shock of blows and kept the cold from turning armor into ice. You can almost picture a soldier tightening his straps, feeling that thin layer of luxury beneath the steel, a private comfort never mentioned aloud. A monk's record from the late 12th century describes the moral unease some clergy felt about the trade. They worried that killing animals for warmth defied the spirit of pilgrimage. Yet in the same breath, he admits that he slept each night beneath a sheepskin cloak. His words read like a sigh rather than a sermon. "The Lord forgives," he wrote, "for without warmth we cannot pray." There are rumors of stranger practices too. One source claims that Crusaders in the mountains lined their boots with rabbit pelts, believing that the quickness of the animal would pass into their feet and keep them warm. It sounds foolish now, but perhaps it worked. The mind, given something to believe, can turn superstition into comfort. By nightfall, the camp looks almost like a gathering of beasts rather than men. The firelight glints on pelts and hides, their edges shifting like waves. The soldiers seem larger, wrapped in layers of animal strength. The air smells heavy with musk and smoke, but also with safety. In this shared wilderness, man and creature have become partners in survival. You can almost feel the fur under your own fingers now, soft, dense and faintly oily, holding the day's warmth against your skin. It is a primitive kind of luxury, one that requires no art and no approval. The Crusaders learned that sometimes the most human act is to borrow from nature, to wear the world instead of fighting it. As the wind picks up again, the firs rustle like whispers. The camp glows softly beneath them, every soldier carrying a small portion of the wild on his shoulders. And somewhere within that warmth, a quiet realization settles, that to survive the cold is not to conquer it, but to make peace with it. The air crackles with tension tonight. It is not only the cold that bites, but tempers sharpened by exhaustion. Around the camp, the firelight wavers over faces tight with frustration. The long march, the sleepless nights, the endless ache of chill have made the air itself feel brittle. A single spark, and it could shatter into argument. You stand near the edge of one fire, listening to a group of knights argue softly over rations. The steam from their breath mixes with words that sound too sharp for friendship. According to several surviving letters from the Second Crusade, tempers often flared during the coldest months. Hunger and fatigue stripped away courtesy faster than any enemy blade. One chronicler noted that the frost made the heart cruel. The words ring true even now. It was not hatred that drove men to quarrel, but sheer discomfort. When your fingers sting and your stomach growls, patience feels like a distant luxury. A curious record from a French soldier tells of a scuffle between two captains over a single jug of wine. One claimed command rights, the other claimed thirst. The fight ended when the jug cracked and spilled its contents onto the frozen ground. The writer adds dryly that both men stood staring at the wasted wine in silence, their anger melting as quickly as the liquid froze. Historians cite the story as an example of how quickly rage turned to regret in the crucible of cold. Modern scholars continue to discuss whether the strain of winter made the Crusader armies more volatile. Some argue that shared suffering built solidarity, others that it exposed the fragile threads of command. Evidence points to both. A camp that could sing together at night could still splinter by morning. The cold did not discriminate between leaders and foot soldiers. It tested every bond equally. A lesser-known account tells of a knight who tried to strike his squire during a freezing march, but was too weak to lift his sword. The sight apparently reduced both to laughter. That strange moment of shared helplessness, recorded in a brief diary note, shows how absurdity sometimes dissolved anger better than authority ever could. There were deeper tensions too. Supplies were scarce, and decisions about who received warmth and food carried the weight of judgment. A priest might argue that charity should favor the sick, while a captain insisted that soldiers needed strength for battle. Every night became a negotiation of ethics fought beside a dying fire. One obscure chronicle describes how commanders sometimes forced men to build communal fires instead of private ones, believing shared heat would prevent isolation and jealousy. Yet the same source admits that men still crept away to guard their own embers, unwilling to trust others with the little warmth they had. It was not malice, only fear. To share was noble, to freeze was fatal. An odd yet vivid letter from a Venetian archer mentions that during one particularly bitter storm, men began shouting into the wind, venting their rage at the sky. He wrote that the noise rose like prayer but had no faith in it. The description feels painfully human, a release of anger at the one enemy no sword could touch. Perhaps that sound, half curse and half lament, was the real music of the winter campaigns. Archaeological studies of abandoned camps show evidence of hasty departures and broken tools, signs of disorder that match written accounts of fights and desertions. Yet alongside them, researchers have found objects carefully repaired and shared a pot mended 3 times, a cloak stitched from scraps of many others. The contrast is striking. It tells of people who quarreled fiercely but still found reasons to cooperate. One chronicler of the Third Crusade described a strange reconciliation that followed one such quarrel. 2 men, after fighting over bread, spent the next night building a fire together. When asked why, one replied, "Better to warm beside a fool than freeze beside pride." That single line, tucked into a margin of the manuscript, feels like wisdom carved from hardship. The cold revealed character as surely as any battle. A man's strength was measured not only by the sword but by how he treated those shivering beside him. For every argument, there were also quiet acts of kindness. A glove shared, a portion of soup divided, a cloak draped over a stranger. These gestures rarely made it into official histories, but they were the true victories of winter. As the fire before you burns low, the quarrel nearby softens. The men fall silent, ashamed perhaps, or simply too tired to continue. One passes the last scrap of bread to the other. The night grows calm again. In the flicker of the flames, the tension dissolves like frost under sunlight. The warmth returns, not from the fire, but from forgiveness that glows quietly between them. You realize then that survival was not only about tools and fabric and flame, it was also about endurance of the spirit. Anger spent too freely could freeze a heart faster than ice. What saved the Crusaders in the end was not strength, but the fragile warmth of mercy that kept them human, even when the world around them turned to stone. Snow begins to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the camp in silence. The flakes drift through the air like feathers, landing on helmets, cloaks, and the tips of spears. You can hear the faint hiss as they touch the embers of the fire and vanish into steam. The soldiers glance upward, caught between awe and dread. They have seen this before, and they know what it means. A storm is coming. According to the chronicles of the First Crusade, blizzards struck the armies without warning, turning roads into traps and tents into tombs. One priest described how the sky fell upon the earth in white sheets, smothering even prayer. The words carry both terror and reverence. For men who believed the world to be ruled by divine will, snow felt like both punishment and proof. A curious note in a later account mentions that when storms hit suddenly, the Crusaders would drop their gear and huddle in circles, covering themselves with their cloaks and packs, forming what they called rings of breath. Each man faced inward, heads bowed, exhaling warmth into the shared space. Modern historians see this as one of the earliest descriptions of a survival tactic still used by explorers centuries later. It is a strange thought that desperation can invent wisdom lasting far beyond its time. Another chronicler writes of a storm so fierce that it buried entire wagons. The men dug with bare hands until their nails split. When they reached the horses trapped inside, the animals were already stiff. He recorded it without flourish, simply stating, "The Lord tested our hearts." Archaeological findings in Anatolia later uncovered remains of carts and animal bones clustered together beneath layers of silt, silent confirmation of the truth behind that sentence. Some modern experts argue that these blizzards shaped more than logistics, they altered belief. In their eyes, the storms forced men to confront the limits of divine favor. For every miracle they thought they saw in the sky, the same sky could take it away in a heartbeat. The tension between faith and fear hardened into something new: endurance. A lesser-known diary kept by a Lombard soldier describes what he called the miracle of warmth. During a particularly brutal night, when snow filled the tents and fires died, a faint glow appeared in the sky. He wrote that the men saw it as a sign of God's mercy and took courage. The next morning they discovered that the glow came from lightning striking in the distance, not heaven's fire. Still, they spoke of it as salvation. The mind, longing for hope, will take what it can find. There are quieter moments too. One record tells of a man who spent an entire storm sitting beside his tent, carving small crosses into bits of wood. When asked why, he said that the act kept his fingers from freezing and his soul from despair. The chronicler called it madness, but perhaps it was simply prayer given shape. Archaeological surveys near the site of the siege of Ascalon have uncovered patterns of burned soil arranged in neat lines. Scholars believe these were fire trenches used to melt snow and create walkways through the camp. The idea was simple but ingenious. Light, small fires in sequence to clear paths. using warmth to fight back against the white weight of the world. A strange legend persists in some later writings that during one of the worst storms, a column of soldiers claimed to see an angel walking across the snow. The figure glowed faintly blue and vanished when they approached. Historians dismiss it as illusion born of exhaustion and moonlight. Yet in the minds of the men who saw it, the vision became proof that their suffering was seen, if not spared. Experts still debate how many lives the cold claimed during those winters. The numbers vary, the causes blur, but the feeling that runs through every account is the same: awe. Even in misery, the soldiers described beauty. They wrote of snow that sparkled like powdered glass, of nights so quiet that they could hear ice cracking miles away. The cold did not only kill, it humbled. You stand now among them in imagination, the storm closing around you. The wind stings your face, but you can still smell the smoke from the nearest fire, faint but real. It carries a promise that the flames have not gone out, that somewhere nearby, life continues to resist. You pull your cloak tighter and close your eyes against the snow. The blizzard roars, but inside its noise there is a strange peace. It erases fear, anger, even thought, leaving only breath. This is what the Crusaders must have felt, the raw, wordless clarity that comes when nature strips everything away. The storm will end. It always does. And when it does, they will rise again, shake the frost from their cloaks, and begin the slow work of rebuilding warmth from ashes. When the storm finally passes, the world emerges in silence. The snow lies smooth and bright under a thin sun, glistening like glass across the plain. The camp begins to move again, slow at first, then steadily, as if life itself is stretching after a long sleep. Shapes appear among the tents that you had almost forgotten in the long nights of war. Women move between the rows of canvas, their arms full of cloth, food, and bundles of kindling. The presence of women in Crusader camps was not unusual, though it was rarely mentioned with respect in the official chronicles. Yet their role, often hidden, was essential to survival. According to most records, the crusading armies carried with them not only soldiers and priests, but also wives, servants, washerwomen, and healers. They followed the armies for years, working quietly in the background. They cooked, mended, tended wounds, and helped maintain a fragile thread of comfort amid chaos. When the cold settled in, their labor became the difference between life and death. A letter written by a knight to his brother back home describes how the women of the camp gathered straw and scraps of cloth to make bedding. He admits that their skill with sewing and firekeeping saved many lives. Their hands, he wrote, were warmer than the fires. The tone of the letter carries both gratitude and wonder. It seems that even hardened soldiers could recognize grace when it brushed against them. A curious entry from a German chronicler recounts that women sometimes formed small groups, tending shared fires, and offering warmth to those who came in from the night watch. The men called these circles the Hearth of Mercy. Historians debate whether this was literal or poetic, but the image remains powerful. You can imagine the soft sound of women's voices, the rustle of skirts, the quiet discipline with which they turned cold air into something livable. There are accounts of healers who used oils mixed with herbs to rub frostbitten skin, saving fingers and toes from blackening. A monk writing from Antioch describes one woman who brewed a thick drink of honey, wine, and garlic, claiming it drove the cold from the lungs. He admitted reluctantly that it worked. The memory of her recipe lingers in later medical texts copied by clerics who never mentioned her name. Experts continue to argue over how many women traveled with the crusading armies. Some say only a few, others suggest hundreds in larger camps. The evidence is scattered: fragments of jewelry, combs, and cooking pots buried in camp ruins. Each small artifact hints at a story of resilience too ordinary for grand chronicles but too vital to forget. A lesser-known detail from a Venetian sailor's journal describes how, during one bitter winter, women collected scraps of cloth from damaged banners to make scarves for the soldiers. The irony is striking symbols of war turned into garments of care. The chronicler calls it an act of quiet rebellion against the cold. One strange yet moving story comes from a chronicler who tells of a woman named Agnes who followed her husband across half of Asia Minor. When he fell sick from the chill, she built a shelter of canvas and brush around his cot, warming the space with small oil lamps. He survived. Later, the men in the camp began copying her design for their own wounded. Her name does not appear again in the records, but her idea lived on. Modern historians have found that many of these women came not from noble families, but from towns along the Crusaders' routes. Some joined the march for faith, others for safety, and some simply because there was nowhere else to go. Their endurance mirrored that of the soldiers, though history recorded their deeds in quieter tones. One touching account written by a priest after the First Crusade confesses that he had once despised the presence of women in the camp, calling them distractions. By the end of the journey, he wrote differently. They prayed when we cursed, they gave when we begged, and they warmed the dying. His change of heart feels like redemption, as if compassion itself thawed something frozen in him. You walk now through the imagined camp, past lines of tents and fires. You see women spreading cloaks to dry, stirring pots, washing linen by breaking the thin ice of a stream. Children chase each other near the edge of the camp, their laughter small but defiant. The cold is still here, but so is life, stitched together by care that no chronicle can fully capture. As the sun lowers again, the fires burn steadier than before. You sense that this is the true heart of the Crusader winter, not the battles or the prayers, but these quiet hands that kept warmth alive. The women move through the camp like steady embers, glowing softly amid the frost. You realize that the story of survival belongs to them as much as to any knight, perhaps even more. The days grow shorter again, the light fading more quickly than anyone expects. The cold does not relent, yet life continues to pulse within the camp. If you listen closely, beneath the rattle of armor and the crackle of firewood, you can hear smaller sounds: laughter, the murmur of young voices, the soft call of someone reminding a child to stay near the tents. The Crusaders did not march alone. Among the warriors and priests moved pages, squires, and children who carried no swords but bore the same weight of the cold. According to the writings of several chroniclers, every crusading army included boys apprenticed as pages or squires. They were often noble-born, sent by their families to learn the ways of war. They tended horses, polished armor, fetched water, and carried messages across the sprawling camps. Many were no older than 12 or 13. The records say little about how they endured the freezing nights, but one can imagine their shivering forms pressed close to the same fires as the men they served. A letter written by a Templar knight mentions his young attendant, a boy named Hugo, who nearly froze one night after standing guard too long. The knight found him curled beside a horse, hands white and stiff. He wrapped him in his own cloak and wrote afterward, "He sleeps beside me now, and I feel less alone." The tone of that letter, unguarded and tender, shows how hardship blurred the boundaries between rank and affection. One curious note in the diary of a crusade chaplain speaks of camp followers, children, sons and daughters of soldiers, servants and merchants who grew up among tents and banners. He describes them playing in the snow, shaping crude figures of knights and crosses from packed ice. The image is strange and sweet, a moment of innocence standing in the shadow of war. The same chronicler confesses that hearing their laughter made the cold seem less like punishment and more like the world's breath. Experts still debate how many children accompanied these expeditions. Some historians think their presence was limited to a few noble households. Others believe that entire families sometimes followed, unwilling to be left behind in dangerous lands. The archaeological record supports the latter view. Small shoes, bone toys, and tiny eating bowls have been found in Crusader settlements. These traces remind us that history's grand campaigns were lived not only by men with swords, but by children learning to survive beside them. A forgotten account from an Italian scribe describes how squires and older boys formed small teams to gather wood and snowmelt water during the evenings. The youngest carried bundles of sticks almost as large as themselves, their faces red from the cold. Yet, the same scribe notes, they often sang as they worked, inventing rhymes to mock the frost. He called it childish defiance against the wind. You can almost hear it now, those bright voices carried through the dark. A lesser-known story from a Crusader's memoir tells of a boy who saved his master's life during a snowstorm by lighting a fire inside a broken shield and holding it under a makeshift tent until morning. The boy burned his own hands doing it. The knight later wrote that he never saw courage so small in body yet so large in spirit. It is one of those stories that sound half legend, half truth, but it captures the essence of the time young hearts forced to grow quickly in the cold. Modern researchers point out that these children often learned the art of endurance before they learned to read. They adapted faster than their elders, using play as practice. A monk once described how boys chased each other around the campfires, laughing even as snow fell in their hair. Their joy, he wrote, was a flame that the frost could not touch. Perhaps that joy was the camp's most fragile defense against despair. A curious discovery made near the ruins of a Crusader outpost revealed a wooden whistle carved in the shape of a bird. Its surface was worn smooth by many fingers. It likely belonged to one of those young pages or children of the camp. Holding it now, centuries later, one can almost hear the echo of a tune played to keep fear away. Even the soldiers who had lost all softness in their hearts seemed changed by the presence of the young. Letters from the time speak of men sharing food with the smallest among them, or carving toys from bits of bone. Hard men who had faced death without flinching would weep if a child fell ill from the cold. The historian Albert of Aachen once wrote, "It was the children who reminded the army what warmth truly was." As the night returns, you can see the fires reflected in young eyes, the faces half hidden by hoods too large for them. A boy tosses a stick into the flames, and for a moment the sparks rise high, dancing like stars. Around him, the adults grow quiet, watching. The laughter fades into calm, and the world feels gentler, if only for a heartbeat. The cold may still own the air, but the warmth of youth keeps it from claiming the soul. Among the weary soldiers, those small lives became living proof that the human spirit, once kindled, can glow even in the harshest frost. The morning smells of smoke, salt, and sweat. The sun has not yet cleared the horizon, and the camp stirs slowly, wrapped in fog. The cold air presses down like a weight, and every sound seems louder. The thud of boots, the soft cough of tired men, the creak of wet leather. You walk past rows of tents and feel it the scent of humanity that clings to everything. When the frost came, the Crusaders learned to live with their own bodies as much as with the land, and that was not always a pleasant lesson. Contemporary sources rarely describe the smell of the camps, yet their silences tell enough. They speak of sickness, rot and smoke, of water too cold to wash with, and air too dry to breathe cleanly. One knight, writing from the plains of Anatolia, admitted that the scent of life hung over us, heavier than armor. It was the smell of thousands living close together with little soap, less water, and no comfort but fire. A curious record from a monk traveling with the Crusaders explains how washing became a luxury. When water froze in buckets and rivers turned to ice, men wiped their faces with snow. It left them feeling cleaner, though it burned their skin raw. Some rubbed ash mixed with sand over their hands, believing it purified both body and soul. Historians now note that this practice, crude as it was, actually helped remove dirt and sweat. Survival, once again, bred invention. One strange but revealing detail appears in the writings of a French squire who claimed that the smell of smoke was a blessing. "If you reek of fire," he wrote, "the lice will not love you." He was not wrong. The combination of ash and heat killed pests that thrived in wool and hair. The men learned to sit close to the smoke even when it made their eyes water. To smell of fire became a mark of endurance, not shame. Experts remain divided about how the Crusaders managed basic sanitation during the long winters. Some records mention latrines dug at the edge of the camp, shallow trenches that froze solid overnight. Others describe filth spreading between tents when snow blocked movement. Archaeologists studying Crusader sites have found layers of compacted waste mixed with ash and straw, suggesting they burned what they could to keep disease at bay. The same fires that cooked food and warmed hands also cleansed the ground beneath their feet. A lesser-known report from a Genoese sailor recounts how soldiers tried to scent their tents by burning herbs gathered from nearby hills. He lists rosemary, thyme, and sage among them, calling it the perfume of the poor. The smoke must have hung in the air, mingling with sweat and leather, transforming the camp's stench into something almost familiar, almost home-like. One curious note from a chronicler mentions that the richer knights carried small pouches of dried lavender or rose petals sewn into their cloaks. These little charms were believed to ward off sickness. Whether they truly worked or not, the scent must have brought comfort, a reminder of distant hearths and warm chambers left behind. The chronicler adds, almost wistfully, that even the faintest fragrance of flowers could make hardened men fall silent with homesickness. Modern scholars interpret the Crusaders' struggle with hygiene as more than physical. It was psychological too. Living surrounded by grime and odour forced them to accept that holiness and filth could coexist. The sermons they heard told them that purity was spiritual, not material, and perhaps that belief made the smell easier to bear. One forgotten letter from a cleric in the Holy Land describes how the scent of the camp blended with incense from the priest's prayers. "Smoke of men and smoke of altar rise together," he wrote, "and heaven does not turn away." His words remind you that in their world, even the unpleasant carried meaning. The odour of endurance became the fragrance of faith. There is an almost tender irony in the idea that survival smelled so strongly. Every gust of wind carried the mark of living bodies' sweat, smoke, oil, wool, and salt. The same smells that now might disgust us once meant safety. They proved that others were near, that no one was freezing alone. You walk through the imagined camp and catch those scents in your mind: the acrid sweetness of burned pine, the musk of animal hides drying by the fire, the sour tang of fatigue. It is heavy, yes, but also grounding. It is the smell of persistence, of people refusing to vanish into cold air. As the light strengthens, soldiers open their tents, letting smoke and frost mingle. The morning wind carries away the worst of it, leaving behind only the faint perfume of survival. You realize that the Crusaders, like all travelers in harsh places, came to measure life by smell and sound as much as by sight. The stench of the camp, ugly and honest, was proof that warmth, though imperfect, still clung to the living. The sky glows pale as morning returns, thin sunlight sliding over the frost-bitten ground. Around the camp, the fires sputter and crackle weakly, their smoke rising in slow columns toward a sky drained of colour. The Crusaders begin to pack what little they have, shaking snow from cloaks, stamping the stiffness from their boots. You watch them move and realize that the cold has taught them discipline more than any commander could. Survival has become its own religion. According to the journals of the First Crusade, soldiers developed morning rituals that bordered on ceremony. They began with silence, then movement, each man preparing his gear the same way every day. A monk who observed them wrote that routine is the armor of the soul. By repeating familiar motions, folding cloaks, checking straps, stirring the embers, they held the chaos of the cold at bay. It was a rhythm that steadied the mind even when the body trembled. A curious note from a soldier's diary describes how they learned to start their mornings not by marching, but by warming their feet in ashes. He explains that the fire's residue retained heat even after the flames died. The men would bury their toes in the grey dust until the sting of frost faded. It was an odd, almost childlike image. Grown warriors standing barefoot in ashes, drawing comfort from the remnants of yesterday's fire. Archaeologists later found traces of scorched footprints near ancient campsites, silent proof of this strange intimacy with the earth. One obscure account from a chronicler tells of soldiers facing the dawn together, lifting their hands toward the rising sun to catch warmth on their palms. The chronicler, awed by the sight, compared it to prayer. Historians still debate whether this ritual was born from faith or habit, but the act itself feels sacred. When light returns after a night of frost, it is natural to greet it as salvation. Experts remain divided about how the Crusaders balanced discipline with despair. Some argue that daily structure kept them sane, while others suggest it became mechanical, an empty repetition masking exhaustion. Yet within those routines, small sparks of hope survived. Men who might have given up found strength in motion, in doing rather than thinking. A lesser-known story written by a scribe in the Third Crusade tells of an old soldier who kept a tiny piece of coal wrapped in cloth. Every morning he unwrapped it, breathed on it, and whispered a prayer before tucking it away again. He believed it was a fragment of the first fire he had lit when leaving home. It was superstition, perhaps, but also poetry, the belief that warmth, once kindled, could live forever if tended carefully enough. Some modern historians see this devotion to habit as an early form of psychological resilience. The soldiers could not control the weather, hunger, or disease, but they could control the sequence of their actions. To light a fire, to polish a blade, to whisper a prayer, each act became an anchor holding them steady in the storm. One curious document from a Cistercian chronicler mentions that the Crusaders began marking the passage of winter by counting the layers of soot on their pots. When the soot grew thick enough to dull the metal completely, they said spring must be near. The measure was nonsense, of course, but it gave them something to look forward to. In that superstition, you glimpse the most human of instincts, the need to believe that endurance will end in reward. The mornings in those frozen camps must have had a strange beauty. The air shimmered with frost, turning the edges of tents into delicate crystal. Horses stamped their hooves, shaking clouds of steam from their nostrils. Somewhere, a squire's laughter echoed, brittle but alive. Each breath hung visible for a heartbeat before vanishing, like a reminder of how fragile warmth could be. A forgotten soldier's poem, scribbled on a scrap of parchment, survives from that era. It reads, "We rise with ash on our hands and sun in our eyes, and still we live." Simple words, but they carry the weight of centuries. They tell you everything you need to know about these people who refused to surrender to the cold. As the camp comes fully awake, the fires are rebuilt, the prayers are said, and the march begins again. The ground crunches under boots, and the air fills with the steady rhythm of movement. Behind them, smoke drifts upward from the abandoned embers, marking the place where another night was won. You feel the quiet pride that must have filled their hearts, the understanding that survival itself was a kind of victory. No glory, no battle cry, only persistence. They had learned the secret of the frozen world, that warmth is not a gift but a practice, a daily act of defiance. The Crusaders, hardened by endless nights, carried that lesson with them long after the snow melted. Evening returns one final time. The light fades slowly, like breath leaving the sky. Around you the camp has grown smaller, quieter, more deliberate. The men know how to build their fires now, how to fold their cloaks just so, how to find the small comfort of warmth even when the wind cuts through everything. The lessons of the long winter live in their muscles, their voices, their hearts. According to later chronicles, by the end of each campaign season, the Crusaders had become masters of survival. They no longer cursed the frost but treated it like an old rival whose moves they had learned. Fires were built lower, shields turned into walls, cloaks mended with patient hands. One chronicler from the 12th century wrote that the cold taught us discipline where prayer could not. Those words ring with the wisdom of endurance. A curious letter from a returning knight describes how the habits of winter never left him. Even years later, he found himself waking before dawn to check for embers, or folding his blanket with the same care he once gave to his armor. Historians note how often Crusaders carried these memories home, their minds shaped by seasons of ice. They had learned that comfort is fragile, and warmth must be earned again each day. Another record from a monk writing near Jerusalem tells of soldiers who began to see beauty in hardship. He said they called the frost God's quiet fire, a phrase that puzzled later scholars. Perhaps they meant that even cold held its own kind of grace. The frost marked the world with light, and to see it glint at sunrise was to glimpse the divine in the simplest of things. Experts continue to debate whether the Crusaders' endurance changed the course of their campaigns. Some argue that the cold broke their spirit. Others claim it forged it. The truth lies somewhere in between. Hardship does not make heroes or saints. It reveals what already lives within. The chronicles show both cruelty and kindness, despair and determination, woven together like threads in a single frozen tapestry. A lesser-known anecdote tells of a soldier who carved a small sun into a piece of bone and carried it in his pocket for luck. He said it reminded him that the light always returned, even if hidden. When he died, the charm was found beside him, worn smooth by touch. Archaeologists unearthed it centuries later, and scholars now display it in a museum, calling it the Pilgrim's Sunday. You imagine him holding it through the nights, a private ember of belief. Modern historians who study these campaigns often speak of survival as the Crusaders' truest achievement. Against frost, famine, and fear, they built not monuments but habits, the quiet architecture of endurance. Every act of layering fabric, lighting a spark, or sharing a meal was a declaration that life would continue. These small, stubborn gestures became their legacy. The wind softens now, carrying the faint scent of smoke and cooked grain. The soldiers gather close, not to fight, not to plan, but to sit together in silence. The fire's glow catches the frost on their armor, turning it to gold. You can almost feel the warmth pulsing outward, faint yet real. Somewhere, a priest hums a hymn barely above a whisper. Others join in, not out of ceremony, but because the sound itself feels like heat. The melody drifts upward, mingling with the sparks and the stars. The sky listens quietly. As the night deepens, the camp becomes a constellation of small lights. Each fire marks a victory, not of conquest, but of persistence. These are not the moments history remembers, yet they are the ones that kept history alive. You stand at the edge of the camp one last time, feeling the cold brush your face. The lessons linger in the air, that warmth is fragile, that survival is an act of faith, and that even in the bleakest silence, life hums beneath the frost. Now the fires fade, one by one, until only smoke remains. The stars grow sharper. The air stills. You take a deep breath, tasting ash, salt, and something like peace. The story slows now, settling gently like snow over the fields of memory. You can feel the warmth of the last embers still glowing somewhere inside you, quiet but steady. The voices of the Crusaders fade into the distance, their laughter and prayers carried away by the soft wind of time. What remains is stillness. You picture the camp long after everyone has slept. The fires are out, the world silver under moonlight. Frost sparkles on every tent, every sword, every strand of hair. Yet beneath that fragile layer of ice, hearts still beat, slow and certain. The cold has lost its edge. Your breathing slows too. Each inhale feels deeper, calmer. The frost melts away with every exhale. You are warm now, wrapped in the same stubborn endurance that kept them alive. The night is no longer an enemy. It is a blanket, vast and soft, covering the earth in quiet mercy. So, rest now. Let the echoes of those fires drift through your thoughts like gentle smoke. The world outside is still turning, but for this moment, everything is peaceful. Everything is warm. Sleep well, traveler of history. Tomorrow, the dawn will come again.